Welcome to meeting number 7 of the House of Commons Standing Committee on Public Safety and National Security. Today's meeting is taking place in a hybrid format pursuant to the House Order of November 25th, 2021. Members are attending in person in the room and remotely using the Zoom application. The proceedings will be made available via the House of Commons website. So you are aware, the website will always show the person speaking rather than the entirety of the committee. For members participating in person, proceed as you usually would when the whole committee is meeting in person in a committee room. Keep in mind the Board of Internal Economy's guidelines for mask use and health protocols. Please wait until I recognize you by name. If you are on the video conference, please click on the microphone icon to unmute yourself. Those in the room, your microphone will be controlled as normal by the Proceedings and Verification Officer. When speaking, please speak slowly and clearly. When you are not speaking, your mic should be on mute. A reminder that all comments by members should be addressed through the chair. With regard to a speaking list, the committee clerk will advise the chair on whose hands are up to the best of his ability, and we will do the best we can to maintain consolidated order of speaking for all members, whether they are participating virtually or in person. First, I would like to inform members that regarding the committee's study of crowdfunding platforms and extremism financing, and pursuant to the motion adopted by the committee on Tuesday, February 1st, GoFundMe has been invited and has accepted the committee's invitation. I can also report that GoFundMe has agreed to appear before this committee on Thursday, March 3rd, 2022. Pursuant to the order adopted by the House of Commons on Tuesday, December 7th, 2021, and the motion adopted on Tuesday, December 14th, 2021, the committee is resuming its study of gun control, illegal arms trafficking, and the increase in gun crimes committed by members of street gangs. With us today by video conference from Service de Police de Agglomération de Longueuil, Fede Dogger Director, from the Sûreté du Québec, Benoit Dubé, Chief Inspector, Director, Criminal Investigation, and from the Vancouver Police Department, Michael Rowe, Staff Sergeant. Up to 5 minutes will be given for opening remarks, after which we will proceed with rounds of questions. Witnesses may choose to split their allotted time for opening remarks with other witnesses if they so desire. Welcome to all. I now invite Director Dogger to make an opening statement of up to 5 minutes. The floor is yours.
Thank you. Well, I will try to speak in French, but sometimes in English. Thank you for receiving me. Merci beaucoup de me recevoir.
Thank you for having me here. With regards to firearms and the violence in Quebec, my colleague Benoit has a lot more expertise on the repression aspect, and they've implemented units. There's one in Longueuil, and my team is participating in this. Today, I'm here to say that I've been chief of police for 5 years. I've been in policing for decades, and so we try to do a lot of prevention.
We work really with the community. When the kid is very young, we work on prevention with him in the community with the police officers. Qu'est-ce qu'on a remarqué, c'est que
what we've seen is that as we work with youth, we're able to anticipate issues, and we work with partners, key partners. So we're not talking here about just police officers. We're talking about the village. It takes a village.
It's impossible for the police department to be able to anticipate all the violence that's happening in the community. I read, j'ai lu vos programmes and reintegrate that's been financed by the government. I read also the multi-systemic tyranny MST program. I read also the LRP, the Leadership and Resilience Program that you put in force and is being financed by your government. And I think these are great programs, especially with great indicators to see if it's efficient or not. But, and it's not but, also the police of Longueuil, what we're trying to do is to work the same way with group contact. And this is the new approach that we're doing. It is a new social approach for the police department to be able to be with the community outside the 911 calls and be integrated in the community to be able to anticipate all the violence that's happening. I can tell you, even as our community is around 500,000 of population, I have 1,000 officers, and even in some very rich area of Longueuil, the crime and the young kids are having guns inside the school, inside the lockers. It's incredible how much is changing the mentality of the young people. They want to protect themselves. It's the first time that we see such a movement aware to the violence. So if we're not in the classroom, with the kids from the young age, we're going to be only reacting. And this is the way that the Longueuil police, we don't want to work. We want to be repressive, but we want to work in a proactive way. Voilà. J'arrête là, puis on pourra discuter.
That's all I have to say, and we can discuss later.
Thank you very much. Now I would invite Chief Inspector Dubé to speak to us with his opening comments of up to 5 minutes. Inspector, the floor is yours.
Merci, Monsieur.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. First of all, I would like to thank the members of the committee for giving me the opportunity to speak with you here today. As you know, I'm Benoit Dubé. I am the Chief Inspector, a Director of Criminal Investigation at the Sûreté du Québec. I worked for most of my career in the fight against organized crime, and this since 2003 at Sûreté du Québec. This is our provincial police corps responsible for ensuring the coordination and fight against organized crime throughout Quebec, in cooperation with our partners, our municipal, Indigenous, interprovincial, national, and international partners. The fight against organized crime and different spheres of criminal activities that they are linked to is at the very heart of our priorities. And it's the priorities of our partners too. In 2017, we reviewed the structure of our investigative units in order to be able to act simultaneously in a coordinated fashion at all hierarchical levels with the most influential actors and also on a regional and local level. In our jargon, we call this the three-level strategy. In order to optimize the choice of projects, we also have teams. We have the Intel leading police teams. Over the past 2 years, we've been able to increase this structure because of extra funding coming from the federal and provincial governments. In November 2019, within the framework of the Action Fund Against Violence linked to gangs and firearms, we were able to implement new teams. One linked to the import and traffic of firearms, and the other homicides and disappearances linked to organized crime. We add to this measures that are being deployed and that follow up what was done last year, the Centaur operation. At the heart of Centaur, we increased the team. It became a joint team with the Sûreté du Québec, the Montreal City Police, the RCMP, and the Canada Border Services Agency. So now this is called the Joint Team Against Illegal Firearms and situated in Montreal. We are also implementing an a joint team in Quebec with the police service from the City of Quebec. They have as a mandate to deal with import and manufacturing of firearms. We've increased the investigative ability on all levels. Resources have been added throughout our 6 joint squads and in the local investigative teams throughout the province. Within the framework of Centaur, These teams have as a mandate to deal with distribution and possession of firearms. And so supply, possession, and as I was saying, this is the three-level strategy. The cooperation of our partners is essential for these activities. Right now, our different investigative teams benefit from the participation of the RCMP, CBSA, the Provincial Police in Ontario, and 26 municipal police corps. 7 have just joined us within the framework of the Centaur program. We have resources within partner organizations, the RCMP in the National Support Team for the application of the Firearms Act, Provincial Police of Ontario, Biker Enforcement Unit, Police Service of Mohawk-Akwesasne to reinforce intelligence sharing, and Homeland Security Investigation Unit in the U.S. I'd like to highlight that the Government of Quebec also has announced other investments for Centaur. We have the prosecutor and, inaudible. Other measures were implemented during the past few years in order to accentuate the fight against organized crime and armed violence. To give you an idea, at Sûreté du Québec, we're talking about a structure that went from 245 police forces to 330, an increase of almost 35%, and this over the past 2 years. Adding all these new resources allows us to lead to further arrests. In order for this to have an
You wrap up in the next 10 seconds, please.
Toutefois, afin que ces réalisations
so that this will have a significant impact on criminality, it's imperative to lead to prosecutions. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I would now like to invite Staff Sergeant Rao to take the floor and give us opening remarks of up to 5 minutes. Staff Sergeant, please proceed.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you very much for providing me the opportunity to speak to you all here today. I'm currently assigned to the Organized Crime Section of the Vancouver Police Department, and since May of 2021, I've been in charge of a task force responsible for reducing gang violence within the city of Vancouver. The task force has a mandate to target people and groups involved in the Lower Mainland gang conflict, and we also investigate the possession, trafficking, and manufacturing of firearms. We use a combination of proactive and reactive investigations to target those committing gang violence and react to incidents of gang violence in our community. For example, we've developed a protocol that allows us to proactively target gang members who we believe are involved in planning homicides. This technique has allowed us to disrupt and prevent 7 gang-related homicides before they could occur since May of last year. The Lower Mainland gang conflict is an ongoing conflict that involves approximately 48 gangs in the Lower Mainland area of British Columbia. These 48 gangs have divided themselves into 3 factions that are currently in conflict with each other. In 2021, across the region, the Lower Mainland gang conflict resulted in 46 homicides, 70% of which were shootings, and 11 non-fatal shootings. To give some context to the firearms work that the VPD has done, in 2021, the VPD seized or had surrendered over 1,500 firearms and replica firearms. To date in 2022, approximately 76 firearms have been seized or surrendered to the VPD. Since May of 2021, the task force has seized over 30 firearms directly related to the gang conflict, including 6 of which that have been identified as privately made firearms or ghost guns. In 2021, firearm trace requests were submitted by the VPD for 60 investigations. Out of those that were submitted, 26 firearms were found to have originated in Canada, 21 were found to have originated in the United States, and 26 were not able to be traced to a known source. The VPD also participates in gang violence prevention programs. We refer people involved in the gang conflict to community-based programs that provide support for people to leave gangs before they become the victims of violence. An example of this is the Combined Forces Special Enforcement Unit of British Columbia has an End Gang Life program where they provide support to gang members to attempt to help them leave that lifestyle. The VPD also has 2 uniform gang crime unit teams who are tasked with going out and having direct contact with gang members. They create professional relationships with these gang members and attempt to identify suitable candidates for referral to community-based treatment programs. Based on my experience leading firearms and gang violence investigations, I've identified some current trends that I believe are relevant to the committee. For example, one of the trends we're seeing out here in Vancouver right now is the use of privately made firearms or ghost guns. During the gang conflict, we're seeing more ghost guns, specifically in the hands of people who are involved in active murder conspiracies or people who are believed to be working as hired contract killers. Ghost guns can be 3D printed or modified from what's called a poly 80 handgun. Specific styles of high quality airsoft handguns can also be easily converted into fully functioning firearms. Ghost guns can also be comprised of multiple parts from other firearms, which results in a firearm that has multiple serial numbers on it. All of these factors mean these firearms cannot be traced through traditional systems. Modern 3D printing materials can produce a durable firearm capable of shooting hundreds of rounds without a failure. For example, one of my teams recently completed an investigation where we executed search warrants on a residential home. Inside this home, we located a sophisticated firearms manufacturing operation capable of producing 3D printed firearms, firearm suppressors, and they were completing airsoft conversions, converting airsoft pistols into fully functioning firearms. Another trend that we're dealing with is the use of high capacity magazines. Magazines are modified to accept more than the lawfully allowed 5 rounds of ammunition. These magazines allow for more shots to be fired without the user having to pause to reload. High capacity magazines can be manufactured by altering lawfully purchased magazines, but also through 3D printing. We're also noticing a trend with an increase in prohibited firearms accessories. We're seeing a growth in the use and possession of suppressors, which reduce the sound of a shot. Suppressors are prohibited in Canada, but can be purchased through the United States, where they're lawfully allowed to be purchased and then illegally imported into Canada. They can also be obtained through like items, such as an item called a solvent trap, which can be easily converted into a suppressor for a firearm. And finally, we're noticing that people are manufacturing suppressors from lawfully obtained components, such as basic metals, and then using 3D printers to manufacture parts that are used to suppress the sound of a shot.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
If you've got a very important thing to say, can you do it in 10 seconds?
No, that's I'm good.
Okay, there'll be opportunity during the question period, I'm sure, to expand on some of your points. I'm now going to open the floor to questions for members. And opening the first round, I'll call upon Mr. Shipley, who will have 6 minutes. Sir, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you to all the witnesses for being here today. My first question is going to be directed towards Mr. Dubé. Mr. Dubé, throughout the differing meetings of this committee, we have heard from multiple witnesses that the Liberals' firearms buyback program is ineffective at dealing with the root cause of gun violence. It can be quite costly, and that the resources could be better used elsewhere. Do you believe that the firearms buyback program is an effective tool against guns crime?
What I think is that it's quite complicated. I'm not saying that there's no impact. For sure, it does have an impact at a certain level. I think it's a combination of different acts. But yes, it does have an impact. But it's not the only solution to fight against violence.
Thank you. Then, just to follow up on that, what do you think the number one solution could be to combating this issue?
I don't think there's one solution. As Mr. Duggar was saying, there's a prevention aspect, there's awareness, and the repression aspect. So all these strategies have to be combined. We cannot isolate and say there's one solution. So it's a combination of all these actions that will eventually have a direct impact on the violence level.
Thank you for that. I wasn't necessarily saying there was one solution. I thought maybe there would be a top priority was what I was maybe looking for. This next, and thank you for those, Mr. Dubé. The next question is for Mr. Dagger. I think I might have said that wrong. I apologize. And Mr. Rowe. Montreal and Vancouver are close to the U.S. border, and we know that illegal firearms being smuggled across the border is the largest source of firearms being used in crime. Of course, this would deviate from city to city across Canada. How much of the gun crime in your cities is sourced from illegal cross-border smuggled firearms? And if you could both respond to that, it'd be appreciated. You're on mute.
Okay, sorry. Can you hear me now?
Yes, and thank you.
Okay. In Longueuil, for Longueuil, it is not high. We know that we did some transition in throughout the territory, but we don't have a main issue with the gun control in Longueuil. What we have though, it's with the youth in the community. What we see, et ce qu'on voit de plus en plus, c'est que les
What we see increasingly is that youth are arming themselves because they're scared. That's one aspect. And the other aspect is that some youth are paid by organized crime to go commit shootings. So, do we have a lot of arms trafficking in Longueuil? No.
Just before Mr. Rowe speaks up, then I just need some clarification, Mr. Dagger. My question was going to be more: the guns that are coming in, that you're seeing in your community, are most, or where are they coming from? Are they smuggled from the U.S.?
Yeah, they are.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Rowe?
Yes, sir. So we are also seeing firearms that are smuggled in from the United States, particularly handguns. The United States is a regular source of handguns into our gang conflicts. However, one of the other trends we're seeing right now is the importation of firearms parts from the United States that are being used to create privately made firearms, being used to create ghost guns. We recently had an importation of 50 Glock barrels and slides. These are parts that can be lawfully purchased from the United States and shipped without a license here in Canada. However, these parts are being used to manufacture the untraceable ghost guns that we're seeing being used in our gang conflict.
Thank you, Mr. Rowe. Your opening remarks stuck out to me too about the ghost guns. I don't know a lot about guns. I'm learning more throughout this committee. That seems to be a trend that's developing that's obviously concerning to everyone. Is that something you're seeing increasing recently or just been going on for a while? And how are we going to prevent more of this ghost guns? I was shocked to hear some of the numbers you used in your opening remarks.
Well, sir, it's going to be very challenging. The ghost guns are able to be produced using a 3D printer. 3D printers can be purchased lawfully from a variety of stores for as low as $300. The materials used to produce the firearms, the plastic material that's fed into the printer, can work out to literally dollars per firearm to produce each one. It's very challenging. We're right now actively targeting people who we believe are manufacturing ghost guns. And we're actively targeting, working with our partners in the RCMP, provincially with CFSEU, and then also the CFSU Firearms team, and also with NWES, the National Weapons Enforcement Support Team. And we're working hard to target people who are importing firearms parts, people involved in the sale of firearms parts, and then attempting to use that information to identify opportunities to take enforcement against ghost gun manufacturing.
Thank you for that. I think I'm running out of time, so my final question is back to Mr. Dagger. I've read that your department, and you mentioned it in your opening remarks, that you've tried to make community policing a crucial part of your policing strategy. Has this resulted in a substantive reduction in gang crime or diverted youth away from joining gang? How effective has your programs been?
Well, how effective? I'm being blessed, maybe, I don't know. But since I'm right next to Montreal and next to Laval, two big cities in the province of Quebec, in Montreal, I don't know if Benoit can agree with me, we are over 200 shootings. And in Laval, around 50 to 55 shooting in 1 year. In Longueuil, we have only one.
Thank you very much, Mr. Dagger. I'm sorry the time is up.
Okay.
I would now like to turn the floor over to Mr. Chang, who will have 6 minutes to pose his questions. Sir, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you so much. Thank you to all the witnesses for participating in our event today. I wanted to direct my question to Staff Sergeant Michael Rowe of BPD. In regards to your presentation about gang violence and gang crimes in Vancouver, what your law enforcement agency to address the domestic movement of illegal firearms?
Thank you for the question, sir. Yes, we work very closely. Being in the Lower Mainland, we have a lot of municipalities that are very close to each other, bordering on each other. We have a number of information sharing initiatives, such as weekly, bi-weekly, and monthly conference calls between all of the police forces in the region who are responsible for dealing with firearms trafficking, firearms offenses, gang violence, and working on the Lower Mainland gang conflict. We share our information effectively through our various investigative and reporting systems. And we also work very closely with our provincial and federal partners to identify opportunities to work together to combat gun trafficking and illegal firearms manufacturing.
Thank you so much. Earlier, you had mentioned about the gun barrels being shipped across the border, not requiring license. Would you have a suggestion, and if there's a possibility of stopping these shipments since they don't require a license?
Well, yes, sir. I mean, I'd respectfully like to submit that it would be a potential solution would be to bring in legislative remedies requiring that regulate the possession, sale, and importation of firearms parts, such as barrels, slides, trigger assemblies. This type of legislation would give us, the police, the tools necessary to be able to seize these items, be able to conduct enforcement action, and be able to start to target or more effectively target the manufacture of privately made firearms.
Thank you so much. And how do you think information sharing between law enforcement agency, would that be good to improve, to address gun and gang violence across the major cities in Canada?
Yes, sir. I mean, information sharing, information is one of our key tools to conducting any type of successful enforcement action. So the more information sharing we can engage in, the better. I do believe we work very effectively with our partners on a variety of different levels. However, and I know our RCMP partners at the National Weapons Enforcement Support Team and West do a very good job of coordinating the various municipal agencies together.
Thank you so much. Okay, and next question is for Inspector Dubé, Chief Inspector Dubé. How do you think your service does in terms of information sharing between law enforcement agency? Would that address or improve the gun and gang violence within Canada?
That's for sure. I'm really proud what we're doing in the province of Quebec with our partners. We are embedded with 26 municipalities like Longueuil, Laval, Montreal, sharing all the intelligence, and also with the USC, the American, and with the RCMP. So for sure, like I was saying, the intel leading policing is really there to be more effective. So the sharing is going really good all around also the country with all the community we have. But like I said, I'm really proud in Quebec what we're doing since the last couple of years.
Thank you so much, Inspector. And what are some of the successes your police service has had in relation to gang violence, and what can other police services take away from what you're doing in the province of Quebec in terms of to prevent gang violence?
I think that the strategy we're having, that we're doing repression on possession, distribution, and being embedded with all the law enforcement, and also what Director Daguerre, also the prevention that are doing, we're also with the kids to join. So like I said, we see that we're not just attacking the top, we're attacking from bottom to top, and doing pressure every day to seize gun, but also the prevention that we're also doing. So I said, like I say, for us, there is the 3-level strategy is really working.
Excellent. And have you seen any positive outcome of your 3-level strategy?
Yes, we see a lot. If we see the lines and arrest, more than 150 seizure of gun. With that, we seize drugs also, and we put that pressure. So that 3-level strategy, we're doing and we seize 3D impression. So we're doing everything we can. So we're seeing result. If we're compared the last 3 months since Santor is it's been in place, we're seeing those results. So it's for sure, we're talking about 3 months. I think next year will be again better than we're doing now.
Great. Thank you for your answers and thank you for your cooperation. Mr. Chair, those are my questions for our witnesses today.
Thank you, and you were perfectly on time, Mr. Chang. Congratulations. I would now like to turn the floor over to Ms. Michaud, and you have 6 minutes to pose your questions. Over to you.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Merci aux témoins.
Thank you, and thank you to the witnesses for being here. More particularly, Mr. Dubé, thank you for accepting our invitation. I'd like to hear you speak on the results, or rather the success of the Centaur operation. Before that, a few days ago, the Mohawk-Akwesasne, the Band Council came and spoke to us on the situation of their situation. They have very specific geography. There's quite a few jurisdictions, Ontario, Quebec, the U.S., so many police corps. And Centaur seems to be a collaborative space, I think, between different police organizations. But it remains that there are issues and that smugglers are taking advantage of this. There seems to be a little bit of a lack of cooperation or lack of communication or resources on the field in order to stop firearm smuggling. We're talking about 500 firearms a week that can go through this territory, and that we cannot stop all of them. So I'd like to hear you speak on this. Sure. If we're talking about Akwesasne, I'm in constant communication with the chief there. Yes, it is complicated because of the borders. We sent out extra resources for intel and to find new ways of doing things in order to work together better. So the Centaur squad allowed us to try to find different ways of doing things in order to have a greater impact on the Akwesasne territory. Let us not forget that there's not just Akwesasne, there are other borders that have to be worked with, and this is part of, well, we do have to put energy there, but we have to put energy elsewhere as well. So we are optimizing our partnership. It's not that it wasn't good before, but we always have to improve and to find solutions to have a greater impact in order to seize firearms and to make sure that seizure happens before these guns are in the streets. So we have to do this. We have to work with our partners, our American partners, and our Ontario partners. So we have meetings very often to optimize our work. Yes, with regards to the border and resources, some organizations, such as the Border Services Agency, they say the border between Canada and the U.S. is so huge that it would be impossible to have officers there 24 hours a day. The union tells us if they have more resources, the mandate has been broadened, and if the agents could patrol between the control points, this could improve things. The same was told to us with regards to Akwesasne. If they have more resources, it could be better. So can more resources be allocated? Do we need more money, more funding, more investment, more human resources? Answer. Well, it's hard for me to speak to the SFC or Akwesasne with regards to the human resources needs. What I can say, though, is I can speak to intelligence. The more intelligence we'll have, the greater impact. So if you have more resources, more intel, well, I don't have all the necessary information with regards to resources, but what I can say is if you're going to have an impact, you do have to have the correct intelligence, and you have to attack at the right place to seize the firearms and to reduce the supply. So this is my answer. Intelligence is at the heart of everything. Question, as with regards to intelligence, you talked about your cooperation with the chief. Do you have information exchange with the U.S. and with the New York Police Department, where there might be less information exchange with them? Maybe this could raise red flags if they know that some people are smuggling across the border. Answer, over the past few months, we've built a good relationship with Homeland Security. We've sent resources from the Sûreté du Québec into their squads in order to obtain information. This relationship is being built, and we've been building it over years. We've put more energy over the past few months to tackle the firearms issue. I'd say the fact of having this partnership with American state police, well, we're not there yet, but I'm working on this with Chief Duluth, and we're really trying to find better solutions. I'd like to hear you speak on the different squads that were created over the years. In 2017, there was the SPVM team, 2020 SPVM, another team, Gangs and Guns of the SECU, 2021, the joint ILTA squad. They seemed that it was not implemented. And finally, the Centaur squad in 2021. Why will Centaur yield better results, do you think? Vance.
Thank you.
OK. Au niveau de Centaure, c'est une stratégie.
Centaur is a strategy, and it includes all the squads and the sharing of information to be more efficient. And so instead of being scattered, everyone combined their efforts. And the strategy allowed us to dictate new ways of doing things, to have a greater impact, and to be able to share information in a more efficient way. And this is why we're going to be more efficient.
Appreciate it. Now I will invite Mr. McGregor to ask his questions, and he has 6 minutes to do it. Sir, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Chair. I'll direct my questions to the Vancouver Police Department. Staff Sergeant, I just want to make sure I'm pronouncing your last name properly.
It's Rowe.
Rowe. Okay, Staff Sergeant Rowe. Thank you. In your opening remarks, you mentioned the use of high-capacity magazines. In a previous meeting of our committee, the Toronto Police Service is reported that in a one-year period, they collected 50% more shell casings at crime scenes. Are you noticing a similar pattern in the Vancouver area?
Yes, sir. We are noticing more shots being fired. Even recently, we had a drive-by shooting of a residence, and we noted that over 10 shots were fired in a very short period of time. I believe this is definitely a reflection of the access to more ammunition in the high-capacity magazines, and can also be a reflection of the proliferation of fully automatic firearms as well.
And so the Minister of Public Safety, in his mandate letter, there is an ask of him to require the permanent alteration of magazines so they can never hold more than the legal number of rounds. So that would be 5 for a rifle, 10 for a handgun, and then further banning the sale or transfer of magazines that can hold the more than the legal number of rounds. By permanently altering, like for a police officer looking at a high capacity magazine, is it easy to tell whether a magazine has been permanently altered, especially if it looks like a large capacity magazine?
The current practice right now to limit capacity on a magazine is often people will insert a rivet at the part in the back of the magazine that prevents the follower, the small piece that follows the rounds, from progressing lower and taking a higher capacity. So often we'll look for this rivet. You can often see on magazines where the capacity has been expanded, that rivet is simply drilled out. So it's not a permanent alteration. It's very easily defeated. And then, I mean, the other challenge is the manufacturing of these magazines using 3D printers or the import of these magazines from the United States where they're legal. So I would definitely agree, sir, that the prohibition of high capacity magazines is very important to law enforcement.
Yeah, I was wondering about that. I mean, for me, from a policy perspective, it just seems it would be simpler just to ban high capacity magazines outright so that there's never any doubt for a police officer. Would that be something that you think we should be recommending to the public safety minister?
I would certainly support the outright ban of high capacity magazines, yes.
Thank you. On the question of ghost guns and the 3D printing, from your experience, like, is it a specific type of 3D printer that's needed to manufacture gun components, or are they widely available, these types of 3D printers?
Yes, sir. From my experience and from the education I've taken from experts in the field, we've learned that very basic 3D printers, as I said, I think there's one that's on the market for about $299, commonly available at regular stores. And those printers can, once loaded up with the certain type of filament, the certain type of plastic that goes in them, they can produce a very durable, highly functioning firearm.
Is there any practical way of, like, from a policy perspective of trying to keep track of who is purchasing these 3D printers? I mean, we don't want to go after innocent people who are using them for perfectly innocent purposes, but just the ability that they have to manufacture these parts. Is there a way of tracking, how suspicious activity might be occurring with these 3D printers?
Respectfully, sir, I would suggest that it's going to be through the regulation of firearms parts, because each 3D printed receiver, the component they can 3D print, requires specific parts to turn it into a functioning firearm, such as a trigger assembly, a barrel, a slide, rails, the metal pieces that go inside it. So if we're able to regulate the sale, possession, and importation of these specific parts, that would allow us to more effectively target people who are putting together the 3D printed receivers into the functioning guns.
Thank you for that. And just switching it up a little bit, you've talked a lot about your proactive and reactive measures with respect to gangs in the Vancouver area. I live on Vancouver Island, so I'm very cognizant of the news that we hear out of our largest port, basically, in Canada. Mm-hmm. Can you talk to me a little bit about what your efforts have been like in high schools and reaching out to youth who are more in danger of falling into gang life?
We do have a couple, we do support a number of programs. Our gang crime units have programs, some that are sports-based, such as there's a gang tackle program that's centered around football. We also have a program in the community called Her Time, which focuses on women and young girls who become involved in gangs. And we also have a very talented and very, very dedicated group of officers who work in our youth sections. And they're very, very good at creating programs that engage youth and bring them into positive contact with the police, that hopefully creates that relationship where they have somebody to turn to should a circumstance in their life come around where they're starting to be drawn into gangs or drawn into this type of criminality.
Great.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Colleagues, we've got 10 minutes left in the hour. So a quick calculation tells me that we can have a representative from each party to speak in the second round. But instead of the full allotment, something less, I'll be as fair as I can be. Mr. Doherty, the floor is yours, and let's say that you have 4 minutes.
Thank you, Chair. Staff Sergeant Rowe, is there these ghost guns, 3D printed firearms? I come from an aviation background. I worked extensively on border perimeter securing measures, interagency, worked with CLU. When you were talking about these ghost guns and the 3D printed firearms, it really kind of struck a nerve with me. Are they able to be avoid detection in the current screening measures at airports and border entry points?
Sir, it's my understanding that right now a lot of ghost guns still require metal components to make them function. So the rails, typically the barrels and the slide and the trigger assembly are still made of metal. I know there are advancements right now for all, full polymer firearms, but currently there's still metal components that would make them detectable to traditional X-rays or metal detectors.
Now, you spoke at length of the huge crime. I'm from Prince George. I'm the member of Parliament for Caribou Prince George, and you spoke extensively about the increasing gang war that we have in the Lower Mainland. But that we've seen that proliferation of gang violence, illicit crime, and opioids up in our neck of the woods as well too. Whether it's First Nations gangs or some of the Indo or Asian gangs or organized crime, other organized crime units or groups into the north. Do you work extensively with that, and do you see any correlation between the importation of illicit of opioids and illegal trafficking of weapons?
Yes, certainly, sir. There's a correlation there that I don't think can be disputed, especially the importation of fentanyl or the manufacture of fentanyl and sale of fentanyl produces an extremely lucrative drug market. And that lucrative drug market does typically invite conflict that will then result in gang violence. And I know from the Lower Mainland to the north, northern industries produce very attractive markets for drug trafficking, which causes a lot of the groups involved in our Lower Mainland gang conflicts to then migrate north in order to take advantage of those lucrative drug markets.
I did some work up in Fort McMurray early on in the 90s, and I was staggered and I worked with interagencies and staggered to learn about the amount of drugs that were going in and out of the camps that were up there, and it was quite shocking. We have a huge problem with recidivism in my riding, specifically Williams Lake and in Prince George, where it seems 90% of the crime is committed by the same people. We can't seem to keep them off the streets, and we can't keep illegal weapons out of their hands. What can we do at the ground level and the municipal level, and how can we help to end the violence and keep these guys off the streets?
Well, it's from a municipal policing level, it would be increasing funding, especially when it comes to firearms, being able to provide funding to put together local municipal firearms enforcement teams. Our provincial and federal firearms enforcement teams, I believe there's more work than they can they have the capacity for, and funding to provide local municipalities, whether it's municipal RCMP detachments or municipal departments such as Vancouver, being able to provide us with a dedicated firearms enforcement capacity would go a long way to being able to make more arrests, lay more charges, but also get more firearms off the streets.
And I probably I'm dying moments here. I just want to say thanks to all of the officers that are on here for your service. I know that the work that you do very often goes unthanked, and we appreciate, all of us appreciate the service that you provide. So thank you. I think that's the end of my time, isn't it? And,
yes, perfect. Thank you very much. I'll now invite Mr. Nur Mohammed to take the floor with 4 minutes, sir.
Thanks very much, Mr. Chair. And just to echo my colleagues, thank you very much to all of you for coming. It's important to have your voices in this conversation. I'd like to start with Staff Sergeant Rowe. First of all, thank you for all that you and the VPD do. It's great having you in my constituency in Vancouver, Granville. And I have to say, when you talked about the ability for people to make firearms on their own, I was at the Best Buy just behind VPD HQ. And you can buy exactly that machine you're talking about right there. So, I wonder, listening to this, when you think about where these weapons are really coming from and where we should be focusing our efforts, would you say, first off, that it is primarily a concern about domestic weapons, domestically manufactured weapons, domestically trafficked weapons, or is it really a border issue? I'd love to hear your perspective on that. And then I've got another question for you around sort of the manufacturing of these weapons and what we might do.
Well, sir, I mean, not to split the difference, but I believe it's a equal problem on both sides. Firearms, especially handguns, are being brought in from the United States, and these handguns are not being used for any lawful purpose. They're being used to commit violence, and we definitely need to work with our partners at CBSA and the RCMP border integrity teams in order to be able to combat that those illegal importations, but also the being able to make sure that domestic firearms are secured and domestic firearms are not falling into the hands of the criminal element through theft or the use of straw purchasers. And a straw purchaser is somebody who has a lawful firearms license, who's able to lawfully purchase firearms, but who's being used by the criminal element to go out and purchase non-restricted firearms that are then entering into the criminal groups through that kind of lawful means.
Got it. Well, let's dig in if we could a little, because I know we don't have much time, but I'd love to dig in onto this question you raised around the reflection or the regulation of parts that are required to manufacture weapons. Can you talk a little bit about what you would like to see in an ideal world? How would this roll out, and what would be some of the recommendations you'd have around this? Because this is something it's uncharted territory, and I think it's something that we do need to get our hands around very, very quickly.
Yes, sir. I'd like to see the regulation of the purchase of parts. As I said, we had a target recently who purchased 50 Glock slides and barrels. I would be hard pressed to find a lawful reason for a legal gun owner, a gun enthusiast, to possess 50 slides and barrels. It's simply not a consumable part that you wear out that quickly. Same thing with trigger assemblies. Definitely, I see there's a need for gun enthusiasts and lawful gun owners to be able to replace their trigger assemblies, to be able to upgrade their trigger assemblies. But when these are being purchased en masse or in bulk, being imported or being possessed in bulk, I believe it's definitely an indicator of firearms manufacturing. So I would like to see some type of regulation into the purchase, importation, and possession of key firearms parts that are being used to manufacture ghost guns.
Fantastic. And I suspect I'm running out of time, but I'll say one more thing very quickly. And if you would be willing, and your colleagues as well, recommendations like these are super helpful to us. So if you might be willing to provide us any additional recommendations in writing around this, or what you might like to see in terms of legislation, be very, very helpful to us. So I'll leave that invitation open to you and to your colleagues, sir. And again, thank you all for your service, and thank you for what you are doing to keep our community safe.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Now I will invite Ms. Michaud to take full advantage of her 2 minutes. The floor is yours.
Monsieur le Président. Merci.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I have another question for Mr. Dubé. With the issue of firearms and what we see in Montreal and downtown Montreal in 2021, we have Geneviève Guilbeault, who announced the Centaur operation, $90 million. Then there was a prevention plan. It was announced $52 million. And we understand there's federal funding coming for some of this, but Quebec seems to be a little bit more proactive in its fight against organized armed crime. I'd like to know if you think the federal government, given that it's managing the border, do you think that legislative changes can be done to control firearm smuggling? Do you think the feds could do more to be more proactive? It's a good question, Mrs. Michaud. So, as Mr. Rowe was saying, the border and importation and what we have, you can have a legislative change. It will help us when we talk about parts. Even Canada Post, some parts are being sent through Canada Post, and right now we cannot go and seize parts with the current laws. So we do need legislative changes, and this will help us to be increasingly proactive. And so this everything that has to do arms, manufacturing, parts, and this is hard to control because the part itself is legal. It's the firearm that's illegal once it's been assembled. So as Mr. Rowe was saying, it's very difficult to investigate when it starts. You have a part that's sent from the U.S. and it ends up in Quebec as a firearm. Thank you. I don't imagine I have a lot of time, but in a couple of seconds, and I know that there are many solutions and we can act on many different fronts. What would you like for the federal government to hear as a message to fight against firearms smuggling? As I was saying, gun crimes and seizures of guns, oftentimes they come from the U.S. And so in Quebec, we have to put our energy here. It's at the border, the U.S.-Canada border.
Thank you very much. Mr. McGregor, you will close out this panel and this portion, and you've got 2 minutes to do it. Thanks very much. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Chair. Staff Sergeant Rowe, I'll just continue with you for the 2 minutes. We have heard repeated testimony during this study of the intricate links between the drug trade and the firearms trade. And I know in Vancouver, British Columbia, we have served as the epicenter for the ongoing opioids crisis. We know that with the introduction of substances like fentanyl and carfentanil, they have increased the toxicity of the drug supply. They are far more addictive, and they are able to be smuggled in relatively smaller amounts because of their potency. Can you maybe, in the time that I have remaining, just talk a little bit about the last 6 years and what the introduction of carfentanil and fentanyl has done to the drug trade and how that has impacted gang activity in the entire region?
Well, yes, I mean, the introduction of fentanyl and the popularity of fentanyl into the drug trade has changed it significantly, both in how we see controlled substances imported into Canada, how the precursors for them are imported into Canada, the sale of these controlled substances on the street, and the profitability. And the profitability has increased significantly, and it's my belief that where there's significant opportunities to make profit, that's also where you see the violence increase as well as people compete for that market. So I do believe that there's a direct link. We will often now find with the proliferation of firearms right now into our criminal element, we often will find be executing search warrants for drug offenses, and we'll often find firearms. A couple of weeks ago, we were executing search warrants for a place being used to traffic fentanyl, and we ended up discovering multiple firearms in that premise. So there's certainly a link between the two, and there's certainly a link between the profitability that the current drug market provides and the amount of violence that the amount of gun violence that we're seeing.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Rowan. Thank you to all of the witnesses over the last hour who have shared a lot of experience, insight, and wisdom with us, and we are very appreciative of your contributions. Colleagues, we will suspend for about 5 minutes in order to facilitate the change of panels, and then we will resume the meeting. So about a 5-minute break. See you in a bit. to order. And in this second hour by video conference, as an individual, Solomon Friedman, criminal defense lawyer, Michael Spratt, partner, AGP criminal and appeal lawyer, and from Statistics Canada, Jeff Latimer, Director General of Justice, Diversity and Populations, and Lucie Léonard, Director, Canadian Centre for Justice and Community Safety Statistics. They will have up to 5 minutes for their opening remarks. Welcome to you all. I now invite Mr. Friedman to make his opening statement. Floor is yours, sir.
Thank you. Good afternoon, Mr. Chair, members of the committee. Thank you for inviting me to address you today. It's always a pleasure to appear before this committee and support your work. That's particularly the case in regards to the important study before you on gun control and illegal arms trafficking. As some of you may know, I am criminal defense counsel in Ottawa. Aside from being a certified specialist in criminal law by the Law Society of Ontario, I've also developed an expertise in firearms law. I'm the co-author of the only text in Canada on the subject, the Annotated Firearms Act. I've researched, litigated, and spoken widely on the subject. My law practice also involves defending otherwise law-abiding firearms owners who are caught up in the criminal justice system as a result of our complex, ever-evolving, and difficult to predict system of firearms regulation in Canada. There are 3 general points that I would ask you to consider as you engage in your important work. First, any approach to tackling gang violence must employ a holistic approach. If you are focusing on the implement of choice at the time of the offense, the problem has long passed you by. Consider instead the difficult and complex questions. Why did this young person end up where they did? What paths have been foreclosed to them? What do we as a society need to do to ensure that criminality is not a more attractive option than a pro-social life? These are not easy questions. They involve matters of discrimination, marginalization, mental health, substance abuse, and others. Do not be distracted by the barrel at the time of the offense and lose focus on the big picture. In my view, Band-Aid solutions and political proclamations are no substitute for evidence-based policy. Second, ensure that the decisions that you are making are based not only on good evidence, but on a good interpretation of that evidence. One example that comes to mind is the oft-cited claim that 70% of traceable crime guns have a domestic origin. This statistic is a good example of a number that is true, false, and misleading all at the same time. For starters, this counts only those traceable. It is therefore, by definition, a number which will skew towards domestic firearms, as these are much easier to trace. It doesn't count firearms with obliterated serial numbers or foreign firearms that cannot be traced. Next, the definition of crime gun further self-selects and obscures our focus. Crime gun generally refers to firearms, including, by the way, pellet guns and replica firearms, seized by police in the course of their duties. This includes both offense and public safety related seizures. That definition does not differentiate between a handgun used in a gang shooting and 100 non-restricted, safely stored firearms which are seized from an elderly gun collector who is the subject of a police wellness check because his daughter has not heard from him in days. You can see now why that 70% number may be true on its face, but is really irrelevant to the pressing matters before this committee, including the source of firearms used in gang homicides. My third point is this. Canada is in woeful need of a top-to-bottom rethink of how we classify firearms. 2 things, in my view, are urgently required. We need a classification system that is evidence-based, one that classifies firearms by function and not by appearance. A wooden stock versus a black plastic stock should not be the basis for a legal classification. Our current system, which layers order in council upon order in council, is not only irrational, but is also widely seen as unfair and unpredictable. And most importantly, we need a legal framework which distinguishes between what the Supreme Court has called the regulatory end of the spectrum and the true crime end of the spectrum. Right now, all firearms offenses are criminal code offenses. The rural Manitoban who leaves her rifle in her locked hunting cabinet without a trigger lock on it, and the gang member with a handgun tucked in his waistband are subject to the same legal regime. A freestanding regulatory scheme for nonviolent firearms offenses is long overdue. It would ensure that the criminal sanction is only applied to the morally blameworthy. It would unclog our overburdened criminal courts, and it would go a long way to restoring the confidence of over 2 million licensed law-abiding firearms owners in the wisdom and good sense of their legislators. These are not easy questions, And like so many difficult issues, I would urge you to examine the evidence dispassionately and make decisions and recommendations on the basis not of politics, but of good legal policy. Thank you very much for your time. I look forward to answering any questions that you may have.
Thank you very much. I would now like to turn to Mr. Spratt and invite you to give your opening comments for up to 5 minutes. Sir, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and good afternoon, and thank you to all members of the committee for inviting me to address you today. By way of brief background, I'm a partner at Abergel Goldstein and Partners here in Ottawa, and I've been practicing almost exclusively criminal law since 2005. And like Mr. Friedman, I'm a certified specialist by the Law Society of Upper Canada, or I guess the Law Society of Ontario now. I've represented scores of people accused of firearm offenses. Some of my clients were factually innocent, some have been found not guilty, some have pled guilty, and some were convicted after trial. Almost all of them were racialized or suffered from addiction or mental health issues or were struggling in poverty. Now, before I talk about my experience and some solutions, I want to take a step back and look at some of the data. And I'm very pleased that there's been an amendment and some experts from Statistics Canada are here. It cuts down what I was going to say on this point, because historically we are living in one of the safest periods in Canadian history. Crime rates, including serious crime and violent crime, have been trending down decade after decade. And while it's true that there has been a recent increase in firearms-related offenses, the use of firearms in homicides has remained fairly stable for the last 20 years and is dramatically lower than it has been since the mid-1970s. And it looks like there was actually a decrease of almost 10% in gang-related homicides in 2020. So the statistics, I'm certainly not an expert here, but it reflects what I'm seeing in court, don't necessarily back up the premise that there's a rash of new firearm offenses in Canada. Having said that, statistics are cold comfort to individuals who are directly impacted by these offenses, and reasonable people may disagree about the scope of the problem. And I think we can all agree that one violent firearms offense is one firearms offense too many. Having said that, I can tell you what some of the solutions are not, so we can cross them off your list. One tired solution dragged out by politicians after high-profile firearms incidents is stricter bail. Toronto's Mayor John Tory claimed that people were getting out on bail 20 minutes after they were arrested for a gun crime. And Doug Ford jumped on that bandwagon as well, saying that many criminals convicted of gun crimes are back out in the streets in the very next day. To put it bluntly, Tory and Ford are lying. That's not true, and it's not backed up by any data. Without ripping up the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, bail for firearm offenses cannot be made any tougher. Already in firearm cases, the onus at bail hearing is reversed so that accused individuals who are presumed innocent have to justify their release. Conditions imposed upon release are strict. The police monitor those conditions, and prosecutors never consent or agree to the release of people charged with firearm offenses, unless, as we've seen recently, those accused people are police officers. So stricter bail is not the answer, and neither are minimum sentences or harsher sentences, as have been suggested by former Conservative leader Aaron O'Toole and Ottawa's Mayor Jim Watson. Remember, the Supreme Court of Canada ruled mandatory minimum punishments in the firearm context unconstitutional, and we've seen them struck down in a variety of offenses across the country. But even if mandatory minimum penalties were available, say you invoke the notwithstanding clause or recommended that, the evidence is clear that they don't work. They don't deter crime, they don't increase public safety. In fact, it seems that they might actually increase recidivism, and they disproportionately affect so many historically marginalized and disadvantaged groups, and they're incredibly expensive. Real solutions are more complex and are going to carry, unfortunately for you guys, a political cost. One of the big solutions is changing how we deal with drug laws in Canada. Almost all of the firearms offenses that I've seen are connected in some way to drug crimes. It's the system of drug enforcement and prosecution that we have in Canada, making narcotics illegal, that fuels the use of guns. Guns follow profit. And so a system of legalization and safe supply would cure many ills. And one of them is that it would help with gun offenses. Also, and I hope I get to talk about this a bit more, but we need to make sure that rehabilitation and reintegration is available for anyone that wants it. I had a young client recently who was found guilty of gun offenses, and we had to beg and jump through hoops to get the programming he needs. And very lastly, in the 2 seconds I have, a good way to reduce gun violence is to limit the availability of handguns. And that is not a delegation of responsibility to municipalities. That is making the hard political choice and banning handguns. That's hard, and these solutions are hard, but I urge you to consider them.
Thank you very much, and I'm sure that there will be further questions and you'll have a chance to elaborate. Mr. Latimer, you now have the floor for up to 5 minutes for your opening remarks. Over to you, sir.
Thank you very much, Honorable Chair and members of the committee. I'd like to first thank you for the opportunity to present our most recent statistics on firearm-related violent crime. It's always a privilege as a public servant to be able to attend these sessions. The information that I will be providing to you today is based upon 2 surveys within Statistics Canada. The Uniform Crime Reporting Survey, which collects information on all crimes reported to police, and the Homicide Survey, which collects more detailed information specifically related to infanticide, manslaughter, and first and second degree murder. Now note, I will be focusing primarily on 2000 and 2020, which is the most recent data available. As a context, following the remarks of one of my panelists, I would like to explain that in the first year of the pandemic, in 2020, all police reported crime, including violent crime, decreased for the first time in 5 years. Previous to the pandemic, we had seen 5 year-over-year increases in crime. Now, before discussing crimes involving firearms, I would like to note that my remarks will exclude Quebec. Unfortunately, given technical issues with Quebec data, in their firearm data, we are unable to include them in our national figures. So in 2020, violent crime involving firearms accounted for less than 3% of police reported violent crime. However, in the previous 5 years before the pandemic, the rate of firearm-related crime had been increasing year over year. In 2020, there were 8,344 victims of violent crimes involving firearms, again, excluding Quebec. The rate per 100,000 population in 2020 was similar to 2019. Now, in urban areas, firearm-related violent crime involves handguns almost primarily, while in rural areas, the firearm used most commonly is a rifle or shotgun. In some major urban centers, handguns were used in the vast majority of firearm-related crimes, including Toronto at 86%, Windsor at 80%, and Ottawa and Barrie both at 78%. Now, I would like to provide some information very specific to homicides and the use of firearms. The national homicide rate increased for a second consecutive year in 2020, marking the highest rate since 2005. Police reported 743 homicides in 2020, 56 more than in 2019. Of these 743 homicides, 37%, or 277, were committed with a firearm. This is a slight increase compared to 2019. The rate of homicides involving firearms has generally been increasing over the last 8 years. Handguns continue to be the most used firearm, with about half of all homicides committed with a handgun. Gangs were involved in 39% of homicides involving firearms in 2020. This is the lowest proportion since 2015. However, firearms are used in the vast majority of gang-related homicides, and most often it is a handgun. In closing, Statistics Canada recognizes there are significant information gaps still in the national data, including the source of the firearm, and we are continuing to work with our partners to identify and address these critical information needs. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Latimer. I will now invite members of the committee to pose their questions. Up first is Mr. Van Popta, who will have 6 minutes. Over to you, sir.
Good. Thank you. Thank you, Chairman, and thank you to all the witnesses for being with us here today. And and sharing your wisdom and knowledge and experience with this committee as we seek to develop policy to keep Canadians safer. Mr. Latimer, I'm going to turn to you first. Thank you for being here and for the statistics that you're giving to us. At this committee, we've heard the testimony from witnesses who've said that up to 70% of guns used in crime were domestically sourced. And we hear other witnesses say that, no, it's more like 85% of guns used in crime that were smuggled in from the United States. So could you help us with that to understand that a little bit better, such wide variety of evidence?
So I would like to be able to provide you with accurate statistics on precisely that. Unfortunately, at this point in time, we do not have national data. There are some substantial challenges in the way in which these data are both collected and stored in Canada. So I cannot actually provide you with specific information at this time. However, within the next year, we do plan and expect to be able to start collecting these data, but it is taking some time.
Okay, good. Thank you for that. I'm not surprised with your answer, sir, but I should tell you that when I first learned this, I was quite surprised that Statistics Canada would not have good, reliable data on exactly this very important question that is so important to us, so central to us trying to develop good policy. So perhaps you could tell us just a little bit about what Statistics Canada is planning to do in the next year or so to improve our data collection.
So we have been working with multiple partners, including the Canadian Associations of Chiefs of Police, the Public Safety, and a number of our other key stakeholders to develop some feasibility studies, for example, to be able to collect the source of a firearm following the incident of a criminal event. As I said earlier, the way in which it's currently sourced and stored is not allowing for us to have national comparable statistics. But this year, we hope to conduct a feasibility study to be able to do just that. We're also working with Canadian Association of Chiefs of Police and all police forces in Canada to be able to collect information on the racialized identity and Indigenous identity of both accused and victims in Canada. And we're making terrific progress. We've almost finished our national consultation. We hope to roll out national standards very shortly.
Good, thank you. I'm going to turn to Mr. Friedman. Thank you for your evidence and for being here today. And I'm going to put the same question to you. We're hearing this wide variety of evidence, 70% domestically sourced from one witness, 86% foreign sourced from another witness. And I suspect that this goes to conflicting definitions of what is a crime gun. Perhaps you could expand on that a bit.
Sure. And it's good to hear that Statistics Canada recognizes this is a problem because, of course, it's impossible to make good policy without good data. So once again, police services seize firearms for a wide variety of reasons, and they're all maybe perfectly legitimate. So they could collect a firearm at a crime scene, or they could have a noise complaint, go in and investigate it and find, like I gave the example of an elderly gun collector who may be losing their faculties and shouldn't possess those firearms anymore. So they seize them and take them back to the detachment. Those are both absolutely valid exercises of the seizure powers given in different places of the criminal code. But when it comes to making policy, those guns are not the same. So one firearm may never have been involved in a violent confrontation. The other might be, but they're all lumped in together. So I think what it's really important to do is, number one, Statistics Canada needs to take the lead on this because we have really anecdotal evidence coming from individual police services. So to give you an example, I did a murder trial by firearm where the Crown at one point in the proceedings actually put statistics from the Ottawa Police Service about the seizure of crime guns and the proliferation of crime guns in Ottawa. And these are statistics that are being locally collected by police services, and they do not use consistent definitions from service to service. So for example, when I inquired into the definition of crime gun, I got one answer from the Toronto Police Service, which was different from the Ottawa Police Service. So we need consistent definitions. And of course, there's no one better position, no entity better positioned in our government to do that than Statistics Canada.
I don't know how much time I have left, but Mr. Latimer, I'm just going to put it right back to you to talk about a good workable definition of what is that crime gun so that we're all talking about the same thing.
Yeah, no, that's an excellent comment from my colleague. And so we have been working on the definition of both what would constitute a shooting and what would constitute a gun, a crime gun. And we're making tremendous progress, and we're hoping to start rolling that out very shortly across this country. So I think we will be addressing the comments that were raised by my co-panelist.
Good, thank you very much. And Mr. Chair, do I have any time left?
I have 25 seconds, Mr. Van Popten.
I'll just go very quickly with that short period of time to Mr. Spratt. Thank you for being here. You're advocating for a ban on handguns, but we understand that most handguns that are used in crime were smuggled in from the United States, illegally possessed by the person committing the crime. Any comments on that?
Yes, of course, nothing is a panacea and nothing is going to fix the solution or fix the problem in and of itself. But we do see legal handguns be used. Domestic violence and domestic homicides often involve legal handguns and are a large problem in terms of the number of homicides that we see. So nothing is a panacea, but a ban, a total ban would be better than a diffuse divesting of that responsibility to municipalities that would result in a patchwork across Canada.
Thank you very much, Mr. Spratt. I will now turn to Mr. McKinnon. You have 6 minutes of questioning, sir. Take it away.
Thank you, Chair. And I'd like to start with Mr. Spratt. First of all, it's good to see you. It's been some years since I used to see you testify before Justice many times. So I'd like to propose to you that that there seems to me to be a number of different categories of violence involving firearms. Firstly, there is a violence involving people engaged in criminal enterprises, part and parcel of doing business as a criminal enterprise. Secondly, I think there would be, it seems to me there is domestic violence. And thirdly, I would say ideological and extremist sorts of activities. Would you agree with those categories? And if so, would you suggest that there is different requirements for controlling access or controlling firearms access in these different circumstances?
I think so. Each situation is unique, and of course, any violence with a firearm or a handgun creates harm. Even merely possessing it and never discharging it as part of a criminal enterprise can create harm. And those individuals are all in different places, whether it be poverty or domestic violence issues or mental health issues that drive the offense. So I think that different regulations and recognizing the different circumstances of the potential offender and offense are important, but also solutions that occur after a firearm is used come by definition too late for the individuals impacted by that firearm. And so I think that we can do a better job of getting ahead of those problems in each of those different categories.
Can you suggest different means of controlling access to firearms, perhaps in advance, as you say, in respect to these different categories of offenses?
Yes, and I think maybe in all fairness, Mr. Friedman might be more of an expert on this issue, but certainly control about sales, how one possesses a gun and who can legally possess a gun is important. And of course, there are better people to speak to, border controls and the like, but certainly it is always better to not have any sugar in the gas can, so to speak, at all, rather than trying to take the sugar out of the gas once it's been added.
Thank you, Mr. Spratt. I'll take your invitation and we'll move over to Mr. Friedman. So if you'd like to comment on those previous questions, feel free. But I'm also interested in I take your point that a revamping of the firearms regulations from the ground up would be a good thing. But absent that, I understand that there are problems currently with importing of or purchasing of parts that are not necessarily restricted by current regulations. I'm wondering whether the regulations, to the extent they continue, need to be modified to address that problem. Go ahead.
Yeah, so I'll just briefly overlap with what Mr. Spratt was saying in terms of access to firearms. So it's important to remember that in order to legally possess a restricted firearm, and handguns are largely restricted, some are prohibited, mostly restricted, you need to, of course, pass significant scrutiny, including a background check, references checked, and in fact, your name is run daily through a database, the FIP database, which will show flags for mental health, criminality, domestic abuse, etc. So there are very strong controls right now in terms of who can legally possess a firearm. The trouble with handguns, and this is where we get to some other conflicting statistics, and here's a statistic from the PWEU, that's the Provincial Weapons Enforcement Unit, Ontario's Joint Firearms Task Force, in 2018 found that 77% of handguns used in offenses came from the United States. So of course, completely bypassing any regulatory regime. You asked about the regulation part. That's a really interesting question. At least it's interesting when you're a law nerd like Mr. Spratt and I are, because the definition of firearm, in other words, what is firearm, obviously originates in the criminal code, but most of the heavy lifting, as it often is done by our courts. And we have case law upon case law where that question, the very question, which should be an important one for firearms regulators, which is, when does a piece of metal become a gun? When does a collection of parts become a firearm? And at what stage are these pieces regulated? And generally speaking, you have some interpretations taken by CBSA and the RCMP for enforcement purposes, but no real clear answer in the legislation. I think that's something, whether it's this committee or Justice needs to look at in terms of coming up with a definition as to when what should be a simple question, when does an object become a firearm? It's not a simple question, but it's one that absolutely has to be examined in the context of the code and the Firearms Act regulations.
I have like 40 seconds left, so I'm wondering if in the current regulations it is legal to buy parts for a firearm that are not themselves yet a firearm. You can buy parts without having a license, a firearms license?
Well, you can't buy the receiver, okay? So the receiver is the essential part of the firearm, sometimes also called the action. But you could purchase, let's say, barrel, trigger, components, etc. The real problem is not about buying those other parts because they're useless without a receiver. The issue is a partially finished receiver that up to a certain point is simply a block of aluminum before it becomes a firearm. And I think we actually, that is an issue, and it's one that needs to be addressed to ensure that only licensed, background-checked, pre-screened individuals have not only the ability to possess completed firearms, but also possess potential firearms in whatever form.
Thank you very much, Mr. Friedman.
Thank you, Mr. Friedman.
I'll now turn to Ms. Michaud, who will have 6 minutes to pose her questions. The floor is yours, Ms. Michaud.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to the witnesses. Thank you for appearing before the committee. I'm really pleased to hear your expertise, and I think what you were saying was really interesting, Mr. Friedman, with regards to the definition of a firearm. When does an object become a firearm? And I understand that, generally speaking, you're not necessarily for more legislation or more regulation. Would further definition of what constitutes a firearm, a military weapon in the criminal code, rather than having a list of banned firearms? Well, there are similar firearms that are on the market that are not on the list. Would it not be more productive to clearly define what constitutes a firearm and then to legislate?
That question was for me, I assume?
Oui.
Yes.
Wonderful. So that's a great question. So to look here, right? Anytime you want to solve a legal problem, you have to look at how did we end up here. So we ended up here by essentially in 1992 with the passage of the original Firearms Act, delineating what was a non-restricted firearm, what was a restricted firearm, and what was a prohibited firearm. But instead of coming back for further legislation, which would mean really unpleasant things like political debate in the House of Commons about firearms classifications, instead successive governments, both Liberal and Conservative, used the Governor in Council tool to enact regulations which would either add firearms to that list or remove firearms from that list. So my point here is it really doesn't matter if you want stricter gun control or looser gun control. What you need to have is an open and transparent policy debate about it, right? And you can only do that, in my respectful view, in Parliament. And instead of simply, oh, this year we added 1,500 guns to the list, next government's going to take 800 guns off the list. That doesn't advance rational policymaking. Instead, my proposal is that you classify firearms based on their inherent danger, based on their use, other evidence-based criteria. Because you are exactly right, Madam Vice Chair. As of today, sitting here, 2022, you can take two firearms, line them up side by side. They will shoot the exact same caliber round at the exact same rate of fire with a similar firing mechanism. One of them is prohibited, formally subject to a host of mandatory minimum sentences, imprisonment for 4+ years, and the other is non-restricted, can be owned by any licensed individual and used not only for target shooting, but also anywhere it's legal to discharge a firearm, including for hunting purposes. So that type of system, it's pretty difficult to justify the legitimacy of that to your firearms owners who said, I bought this gun a week ago. Today it's prohibited, but it's no different from the gun sitting next to it in the safe, which is non-restricted. So if you want confidence in your firearms regulation scheme, you have to start with rational evidence-based policy. And to do that, we need a rethink of how the Firearms Act classifies firearms.
Intéressant, merci. Et vous...
Very interesting, thank you. And you're also saying that, new regulation, legislative change will not fight against illegal firearm smuggling. It's rather extra actions that have to be done at the border. We understand that the Canada-U.S. border is over 8,000 kilometers long, so CBSA and police services will tell us, well, it's kind of hard to have a human presence over 8,000 kilometers of land 24 hours a day. So how do we do, even with increased resources, how to avoid to have a greater amount of firearms entering into Canada? I can't believe that there's no technological means with drones. I don't know. Are you aware of, or can you tell us, what's your opinion on this? What could be done in order to have more resources at the border?
Yeah, so I'm not an expert on border controls. I defend those charged with firearms importation offenses. You're right that it's a very difficult problem. One of the benefits that we have of having a generally friendly southern neighbor and having enormous amounts of cross-border trade and transportation is that it makes for the potential, just like drugs enter this country illegally every day, firearms do as well. I think enforcement obviously is important in terms of protecting our borders, but we really need to look at the root causes of crime. These handguns are ending up in people's hands who have decided, and I use that word loosely, decided to engage in criminal behavior. They've decided that the profit to be made in drug trafficking and protecting that drug trafficking is bigger than the potentials that they see in participating in a pro-social way in Canadian society. That's an enormous problem. It's a really difficult problem, and it's one that is never going to be solved, not by more police officers on the street, not by more border guards at the border. It's solved by the type of social development policy issues that are far beyond my ken, but I know are key to addressing the causes of gun crime as opposed to simply its symptoms.
I don't think I have enough time left, but I'd like to ask a question to Mr. Spratt. Could he answer the same question? What can be done directly at the border? What can the federal government do? Invest more? Have more resources? What do you think?
Sorry, we're out of time. I'm sorry about that, but that's just what the clock says. I'll move now to Mr. McGregor. You have 6 minutes, sir. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Chair. I'll start with Mr. Spratt. Hi, it's good to see you again, and thank you very much for coming before our committee and providing your analysis on this particular subject. I was very curious about, you have all of this experience representing clients, some of whom have been involved in alleged firearms crimes. And of course, you are aware of the debate that we've been having in Parliament with repealing mandatory minimums. In your experience, when one of your clients was involved in an alleged crime, whether it was proven or not, did they ever think about the specific provisions in the criminal code to sway them to deterring them from committing the crime? Does that actually figure prominently in people's motivation to commit or not commit a crime, thinking of mandatory minimum sentences?
Not for these types of offenses, and that's borne out by the criminological evidence. If you're acting out of desperation, out of poverty, or you just don't give a damn, the minimum sentences or the length of a sentence doesn't deter crime. Where they might is when you have people engaged in complex cost-benefit analysis, but we hardly ever see anyone propose minimum sentences for large corporate crimes or greed in corporations. It might have an impact there, but certainly not in these types of offenses.
And can you expand a little bit more, maybe in about a minute, just about the link between mandatory minimums and increase in recidivism?
Yeah, when you have someone who is detained for a long period of time without programming, without the access to rehabilitation, when they're cut off from their community, and when opportunities are closed to them, when they are not able to make choices about accepting responsibility because doing so would dramatically crush their future, when they are released, they are in a worse position to be rehabilitated and reintegrated. And that's why sometimes we see in some cases, mandatory minimum sentences actually resulted in an increase in recidivism rates.
On the comments that you made regarding how deal almost always are linked with, where I should switch that, firearms offenses are almost always linked to the drug trade. We've seen that borne out in the evidence. And indeed, in the previous panel, the first hour of this committee meeting, when I was asking a representative from the Vancouver Police Department, he stated on the record that the increased profitability associated with fentanyl in the drug system, especially in Vancouver, which is the epicenter of the opioids crisis, he noticed a direct correlation because of the high profitability of that drug of increased gang activity, more firearms usage, as there is competition to control turf. You are aware, of course, of the debate that's going on in Parliament as to whether we should have a declaration of principles in the Controlled Drugs and Substances Act. My colleague Gord Johns is advocating for decriminalization, which has also been supported by the Canadian Association of Chiefs of Police. Do you have any thoughts you would like to share with the committee on that whole subject?
Yeah, one of the most heartbreaking and hard cases I've ever dealt with was representing a young Black man who was charged with first-degree murder. He attended a house to steal some marijuana. It was one of the most tragic cases and heartbreaking cases I've ever seen. And around that time, I saw a number of cases dealing with marijuana and firearms. Since marijuana was legalized, I've seen zero. And I think that is an example. The legalization of drugs and the provision of safe supply will save lives, not just because of overdoses and opioid epidemics and the tragedies that we've seen because of our drug policy. It will stop those bullets coming out of the guns.
Appreciate that. Thank you so much, Mr. Spratt. Mr. Friedman, I'd like to turn to you because I was actually very interested in your testimony about the classifications debate that's going on. In your mind, you talked about the function of a firearm versus its appearance. Do you have any suggestions for our committee? Because, like, for example, if you look at semi-automatic rifles, some rifles, of course, can receive a high capacity magazine, making them far more deadly, while there are other semi-automatic rifles which cannot take a magazine and they have a strict limit on how many rounds they can take. I guess, I'm interested, as in a lot of my constituents, in having a reasonable debate on how we classify firearms. Just, in the minute that I have left, do you have any suggestions about how that system should be reformed?
Sure, that's a great question. It's one of the important questions that I know you're all trying to tackle here. So I'll take your example. You talk about detachable magazines. Something that's really important to remember is that almost every type of firearm, particularly semi-automatic firearms, can be modified. by people with a minimum of know-how. So we take a look at detachable magazines, okay? In Canada, a centerfire semi-automatic rifle is already limited to a 5-round magazine. You possess, don't put it in that gun. You possess a 10, 15, 20, 30-round magazine, you're committing a criminal offense. So remember, the people aren't deterred by that. Let's go to the next stage. You talk about some firearms appear to have a base plate that cannot accept a magazine. All of those can be swapped out. You just go online, you can do a little bit of Googling. You don't even need gun expertise. I happen to have a little expertise, but you don't even need much expertise to know that all those firearms can be adapted to accept magazines. So it's—
Thank you, Mr. Friedman. I'm sorry.
No.
I am a prisoner of the clock. Not always comfortable, but that's my job. We now move into the second round. And colleagues, I'm looking at the clock. We've got 5 or 6 minutes. So I think in the interest of fairness, there should be one question from each party. And the question should be very tight. Let me start with Mr. Lloyd.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'll keep this tight. Mr. Friedman, the Prime Minister and the Minister of Public Safety on numerous occasions have said that their banned firearms were, quote, designed to kill the largest number of people in the shortest amount of time. They were designed for use by soldiers to kill other soldiers, amongst various things. I just happen to have a copy of the Geneva Convention on Conventional Weapons, which Canada is a signatory to. And I'll quote from it: "It prohibits the employment of weapons for the purpose of causing superfluous injury or unnecessary suffering." Mr. Friedman, is the Prime Minister and the Minister of Public Safety misleading Canadians on these firearms for political purposes, or is Canada indeed in violation of the Geneva Conventions?
An interesting question. I'll say as follows. It's unfortunate that inflammatory political rhetoric has taken the place of an informed policy debate. Like, I think this committee is a great example of what can happen when we actually look into the legal, regulatory, and technical sides of these firearms. You know, the statement that those guns were designed to kill the largest amount of people in the shortest amount of time is false. And that's borne out by the fact that we happily equip our police officers with these firearms. We give them to them because they are efficient and reliable, and we know that they operate well in all conditions. The Prime Minister similarly said that, quote, "you don't need an AR-15 to bring down a deer." Obviously, as someone who clearly doesn't understand both the wildlife regulations and the Firearms Act, he would know that the caliber of bullet fired by an AR-15 is in fact considered too weak to take down a deer and is therefore prohibited for hunting deer in virtually every province. Those are firearms that are used for varmint or predator control by farmers regularly. So I think what we need to do is take out the political rhetoric. We don't need to have an inflammatory debate. We don't need to divide people to demonize one group over another. We need to have a evidence-based discussion direction that we want to take gun policy in this country. I think that's what Canadians expect. It's what they deserve.
Thank you very much. Now I'll move to Mr. Zuberi. You have 2 minutes. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'd like to give my time to my colleague, Mr. Nur Mohammed.
Thank
Nur
you.
Mohammed, go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Mr. Zuberi. I'd like to take my time to move the motion that I put forward earlier, and that motion is as follows: that pursuant to Standing Order 108 Sub 2, the committee undertake a study on the rise of ideologically motivated violent extremism, IMVE, in Canada. That this study include an investigation into the influence of foreign and domestic actors in funding and supporting violent extremist ideologies in Canada. That the study include the use of social media to fuel the IMVE movement. That the committee explore the impact of anonymous and foreign donations funding IMVE, including through crowdfunding sites. That the committee invite representatives from Give, Send, Go to appear. That the committee further look at the role of payment processors in preventing the funding of IMVE and invite representatives from PayPal and Stripe to appear. That evidence and documentation received by the committee from upcoming appearances of representatives from GoFundMe and FinTrack be included in this study. That this study include Canada's national security organizations and police involved in monitoring, countering, and responding to IMVE threats, and that this committee report its findings to the House, and that pursuant to Standing Order 109, the government table a comprehensive response to this report. So, Mr. Chair, I'm hoping that we can go straight to a vote and not take up any more questioning time. Thank you.
Point of order, Mr. Chair. Or sorry, I'll take the,
yes,
not
a
point of order. Just asking for the floor, Mr. Chair.
Yes, go ahead.
In the interest of letting our other colleagues finish off this witness testimony, I move that we table this motion and we can talk about it later on in this meeting or another time. And that's a non-dilatory motion, I believe, so it has to be voted on.
Okay, clerk, what is your guidance here?
Yes, Mr. Chair, it is a dilatory motion, so we need to proceed to a vote. It's a non-amendable and non-debatable motion.
Okay, well then let's move right to a vote. Go ahead, clerk.
Mr. Muff?
No.
Mr. Chang?
No.
Mr. McKinnon?
No.
Mr. Noor Mohammed?
Nope.
Mr. Zubairi?
Oh.
Mr. Zubairi?
No, thank you. Do I need to say that again?
No. Thank you, Mr. Zubairi. Mr. Doherty?
No, Mr. Doherty's not here. It's Mr. McGuire.
Mr. McGuire?
Oh, sorry, Todd is here. Okay.
That's okay. I was just listening in as a observer. That's all.
Okay.
Mr. McGuire?
Yes.
Mr. Lloyd?
In favor.
Mr. Shipley?
Yes.
Mr. Van Popta?
Yes.
Madame Michaud?
Non.
Mr. McGregor?
No.
Mr. Chair, yeas pour, 4 for, nays contre, 7-7.
So the motion is defeated and we would move back to the original motion.
Mr. Chair?
Yes, sir.
I'd like to move an amendment to the motion before we move to vote on it.
Point of order, Mr. Chair.
Yes, Mr. McKinnon.
I believe we're at the end of this hour anyway, this panel, so I would suggest that we invite thank our witnesses and release them.
That makes sense to me. They've been very generous with their time. And with the concurrence of the committee, I will thank them and we'll move on to complete this business. Do I have an agreement to do that?
Yes.
Okay.
Thank you to the witnesses.
Okay, thank you very much to the witnesses. Very informed and very helpful.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Have a good day.
Good day.
Okay, proceed.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just adding a slight amendment just to add, not take anything away from the motion, that the committee, so quote, that the committee invite Vivian Krause as an expert on how American money is sourced and transferred into Canada to fund political influencers, end quote.
Okay, so we would then vote on the amendments.
Mr. Chair?
Ms. Demoff, you have a hand up.
Sorry, Chair. Just
You're on mute.
I would say we don't normally specify individuals. We're going to have an opportunity, all the parties, to put forward witnesses for this study, and I would invite the CPC to include this woman if that's who they feel it's important. I know that the Liberal Party has witnesses that we feel are important to hear from as well. So I think we don't need to be this specific. So we'll be voting no on this amendment.
Mr. Chair?
Yes, Mr. Lloyd.
I just find it ironic that the Liberal member is saying we don't specify when the motion itself does specify a number of witnesses. So we're just trying to follow their example by adding our own witness to their motion. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Well, are we ready to vote on the amendment then, clerk?
J'aimerais prendre la parole, Monsieur le Président.
I'd like to speak, Mr. Chair. Yes, I would have a thank you for Mr. Lloyd. Could he tell us who exactly is Vivian Krause? Who is this witness that he'd like to add for the benefit of the committee? Thanks.
Mr. Chair?
Go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I thank the member for that question. Vivian Krause is a well-known researcher in Canada who, for a number of years, has been conducting research into the precedence of foreign funds being funneled into Canada for political purposes. And I think for the purposes of this study, having an expert like her who's been very public and whose research has been widely reported across the country, that she would be a useful witness to talk about, the methods by which this money is being brought into Canada, the methods that it's employed by, and the outcomes that they achieve. And I think she'd be a wonderful witness.
Okay, we have a sub-amendment on the floor. We should vote on that now. Clerk, would you record a vote?
Chair, I just have my hand up.
Oh, okay. Go ahead, Mr. McGregor.
Yeah, I disagree with this amendment. I mean, I think Mr. Lloyd is free to invite Ms. Krause if he wants to. I mean, I will just say on the record, just a quick Google of her name shows that a lot of what she is proposing has been also thoroughly debunked. So, I mean, they're free to call her as a witness. But we specified PayPal and Stripe because the essence of this motion, the main motion, is on crowdfunding. And these are companies involved in processing payments for crowdfunding sites. So PayPal, Stripe, they process the payments for companies like GoFundMe and for Give, Send, Go. So that's why that specificity is in there, and it's following the motion that was passed by this committee 1 week ago. So I'm going to vote against the amendment. Certainly, Mr. Lloyd is welcome to invite her as a witness, but I think we need to keep the main motion as is. Thank you.
Okay. Mr. Lloyd, you've heard the discussion. Do you want to keep your sub-amendment on the table for a vote, or would you choose to withdraw it?
Yep, no need for further debate. I guess we could just vote on this amendment.
Okay, clerk, record the vote, please.
Mr. Malv?
No.
Mr. Chang?
No.
Mr. McKinnon?
No.
Mr. Noor Mohammed?
No.
Mr. Zubairi?
No.
Mr. McGuire, yes.
Mr. Lloyd?
In favor.
Shipley?
Yes.
Mr. Van Popta?
Yes.
Madame Michaud?
Contre.
Mr. McGregor?
No.
Mr. Chair? Yeas pour, 4, nays contre, 7.
Thank you. So the sub-amendment is defeated, and we therefore, clerk, can go back to a vote on the main motion. Are we ready to vote on the main motion? Clerk, please call the roll. Oh, I see a hand up. Mr. McGregor?
Yeah, no, I just, I just appreciate Mr. Noor Mohammed bringing this forward, and I certainly support the main motion, and I'm glad that we were able to work together to make the motion a bit more specific in some areas. But I think given the events over the last week, this is going to be an important study. So appreciate moving towards a vote. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Well, then let's proceed to the vote. Clerk, if you could take us through the roll call, please.
Mr. Lloyd, can I just have the name of the member?
McGuire.
Mr. Malv?
Yes.
Mr. Chang?
Yes.
Mr. McKinnon?
Yes.
Mr. Noor Mohammed?
Yes.
Mr. Zubairi?
Yes.
Mr. McGuire?
Yes.
Lloyd,
In favor.
Mr. Shipley,
Yes.
Mr. Van Popta,
Yes.
Madame Michaud,
En faveur.
Mr. McGregor,
Yes.
Mr. Chair. Yeas pour, 11-11. Yeas, nays contre, 0-0.
Therefore, the motion carries. Thank you, colleagues. We will now suspend for a change of panel. Clerk, I hope we can make this as expeditious as possible. I am very conscious of time lost for technical changes. So I'm going to say we have 5 minutes, and if we don't get it done in 5 minutes, I'll want to know why. Everybody take a short break. See you in a few. Pursuant to Standing Order 1082 and the motion adopted by the committee on Tuesday, February 1st, 2022, the committee is commencing its study of crowdfunding platforms and extremism financing. With us today from the Financial Transactions and Reports Analysis Center of Canada, Barry McKillop, Deputy Director, Intelligence, and Annette Ryan, Deputy Director, Partnership, Policy, and Analysis. Up to 5 minutes will be given for opening remarks, after which we will proceed with rounds of questions. Witnesses may choose to share their time with other witnesses if they wish. Welcome to you. And I now invite Mr. McKillop to make an opening statement of up to 5 minutes. Floor is yours, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, for inviting us to address the committee today.
I would like to briefly speak about FINTRAC's mandate under the Proceeds of Crime, Money Laundering and Terrorist Financing Act, and the valuable role we play in helping to protect Canadians and Canada's economy. Mr. Chair, FINTRAC's mandate is to facilitate the detection, prevention, and deterrence of money laundering and the financing of terrorist activities.
Federal departments and agencies that play a key role in Canada's anti-money laundering and anti-terrorist financing regime. FINTRAC was established as an administrative financial intelligence unit and not a law enforcement or investigative agency. We do not have the authority to freeze or seize funds or cancel or delay financial transactions. This was done very deliberately by the Parliament of Canada to ensure that we would have access to the information needed to support the money laundering and terrorist financing investigations of Canada's police, law enforcement, and national security agencies while protecting the privacy of Canadians. As Canada's anti-money laundering and anti-terrorism financing regulator, FINTRAC is responsible for ensuring the compliance of thousands of businesses with requirements under the Act, including financial entities, casinos, money service businesses, real estate, and others. I will note that crowdfunding sites are not a regulated business sector under the Act. However, when these sites transit with or through businesses subject to the Proceeds of Crime, Money Laundering, and Terrorist Financing Act and its regulations, these financial transactions would be covered under the Act. As part of their obligations, businesses subject to the Act are required to establish a compliance program, identify clients, keep records, and report certain types of financial transactions to FINTRAC, including international electronic funds transfers totaling 10,000 or more in a 24-hour period, large virtual currency transactions totaling 10,000 or more in a 24-hour period, and suspicious transactions which have no monetary threshold for reporting. Mr. Chair, compliance with the broader legislative and regulatory obligations provides important measures for deterring criminals and terrorists from operating within Canada's legitimate economy. Compliance with the legislation ensures that FINTRAC receives the information that we need to generate financial intelligence for enforcement and national security agencies to act upon. The reports that we receive from Canadian businesses are analyzed and assessed. And when we have reasonable grounds to suspect that financial intelligence would be relevant to investigating or prosecuting a money laundering offense or a terrorist activity financing offense, FINTRAC generates a financial intelligence disclosure for Canada's police, law enforcement, and national security agencies. Under subsection 55(1) of the Proceeds of Crime, Money Laundering, and Terrorist Financing Act, FINTRAC is expressly prohibited from discussing any information that we receive or any financial intelligence that we disclose to Canada's police, law enforcement, and national security agencies. What I can say, however, is that our financial intelligence is valued by those agencies, many of whom have told us that they will not start a major project-level investigation without seeking out our financial intelligence. Last year, we provided more than 2,000 disclosures of actionable financial intelligence in support of investigations related to money laundering, terrorist financing, and threats to the security of Canada. Since becoming operational in 2001, the Centre has provided more than 22,000 financial intelligence disclosures to Canada's police, law enforcement, national security agencies, as well as our international partners. Our disclosures include financial information on an individual or a network of individuals or entities suspected to be involved in money laundering or the financing of terrorist activities. They can make links between individuals and businesses that have not been identified in an investigation and can help investigators refine the scope of their cases or shift their sights to different targets. Our financial intelligence is often used by law enforcement agencies to put together affidavits to obtain search warrants and production orders. Our financial intelligence can also be used to identify proceeds of crime and advance the government's knowledge of the financial dimensions of certain crimes and threats, including organized crime and terrorism. Last year, our financial intelligence contributed to 376 major resource-intensive investigations and many hundreds of other individual investigations at the municipal, provincial, federal levels across the country, as well as international investigations.
Thank you very much. Unless you have something that you think is indispensable and you got 10 seconds.
No, sir, c'est maintenant avec plaisir que je répondrai aux
It will be my pleasure to answer the questions of the committee.
Opportunities. Thank you. Now we begin a round of questions, and to lead off, I would invite Mr. Lloyd to use his 6 minutes. Sir, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I want to thank the witness for attending. Wanted to ask the witness, is there a objective threshold that you employ to determine, when something is money laundering and when something is a terrorist activity? My concern is, the word terrorism, can be thrown around somewhat carelessly. And I just want to know, what is your objective standard for what does constitute those activities? Thank you.
Thank you for the question. Mr. Chair, when we arrive at our threshold to suspect that a certain transaction would be relevant to a money laundering or terrorist activity financing investigation, we have a number of indicators that we have developed over the years based on our intelligence. We've also built on indicators that are published and are in existence through the FATF, which is the Financial Action Task Force, as well as AIGMONT, which is a group of financial intelligence units internationally. We also have indicators that we have developed with our domestic and international partners related to money laundering. As most of you likely know, money laundering is the result and the use of proceeds of crime. So typically a crime is committed, and we would see often transactions that are linked to predicate of crimes similar to human trafficking, for example, or drug trafficking or child sexual exploitation material on the internet and the purchase of that. The commission of those predicate crimes and then the movement of money tends to be the lead and the indicator for money laundering. So we do have a number of indicators, and we identify those indicators when we do disclosures to assist law enforcement in understanding why we're giving them the intelligence that we are providing them.
And what about for terrorism, Mr. McKillop?
Thank you, sir. For terrorist financing as well, we have a number of indicators that we have developed. We have also shared some of those. We have shared those indicators with our reporting entities as well. And the indicators assist both on the money laundering and the terrorist activity financing side. They assist our reporting entities in identifying the transactions that may be associated with those. So they are specific, actionable intelligence indicators that can be used to identify suspicious transactions.
Thank you. I'm sure there's a role for legislators, in a sort of creating a framework, as you said, based on the criteria that you use. But do you think it's appropriate, for politicians to, call on FINTRAC to investigate groups as they come up? Is that something that you guys have a mandate to do and that you think would be appropriate to do, or do you think that following your own mandates and guidelines is the best way to conduct your activities?
Thank you very much for the question. Our mandate is, and we were set up very, very specifically not to be an investigative unit. And it's very important to understand that the reports that we receive from our reporting entity under the PCML TFA are warrantless reports that we receive. For example, the threshold reports of $10,000 in or out of Canada, or anything above $10,000, for example, The vast majority of those that we receive are on legitimate Canadians doing legitimate business or legitimate organizations sending money for business purposes. And we have a role in protecting the privacy of that. We are not an investigative agency, otherwise we would not be able to receive the reports that we receive, because we provide the intelligence to law enforcement. Law enforcement will then use that as part of their investigation to develop and obtain the evidence that they need to go forward in court. We are also set up as an independent agency, an arm's length agency from the government. It is part of the Financial Action Task Force requirements for an FIU to be independent of government, to not take direction such as suggested to investigate specific individuals or specific groups. We have our mandate. We know what we need to do. Our reporting entities are very strong partners, and their due diligence that they provide on a daily basis to monitor these transactions and to work with us to monitor the right transactions have proven to be extremely successful. The regime is set up with 13 different departments and agencies, each of which has a specific mandate, each of which work together in order to enhance and to strengthen the regime in Canada and to ensure that we have what we need to have in order to combat money laundering and terrorist activity financing.
Thank you, Mr. McKillop. I only have a minute left, but would you say, like, if at some future date a government attempted to change your mandate so that government could utilize the information that you gather, would that, in your opinion, it seems that this is what your testimony is saying, would that basically make your organization ineffective at being able to do its job? And would you consider that to be an ethical change if that were to be proposed?
Thank you for the question. I think it would be not my personal view per se, but I think there would be certainly when we were set up looking at the Constitution and what would be constitutionally acceptable in terms of transactions being provided to FINTRAC. And the reason that we can get those transactions, we do not blindly provide these transactions to law enforcement. We have to meet our own threshold in terms of suspecting that it may be relevant to money laundering or terrorist activity financing in order to pass that along as an intelligence disclosure to our partners. So I believe
that's
that—
good. That's good. Thank you very much. I appreciate everybody's respect of the clock. I now would invite Ms. Demoff. She has 6 minutes for questions and conversation, and the floor is yours, Ms. Demoff.
Thank you so much, Chair. And Mr. McKillop and Ms. Ryan, I want to thank you for coming on such short notice and for the good work that you do at FINTRAC. My first question is, I'm wondering how crowdfunding is captured under your regime at FINTRAC.
Thank you for the question. Crowdfunding itself and the crowdfunding platforms themselves are not, in fact, reporting entities to FINTRAC, so they are not captured within the regime. There was mention earlier about the payment processors that, in fact, process the payments. So something like Stripe or PayPal, when they are doing MSB type activities, and some of these payment processors do have MSB, money service business activities that they participate in. When they do that, they are subject to our legislation, and they're subject to being registered as a money service business and therefore subject to the compliance program within the PCML TFA. Crowdfunding, however, is not.
Okay, great. Thank you. And then when you're dealing with entities like GoFundMe or GiveSendGo or anyone who's accepting money that's in another country, whether it's the United States or other countries, how do you have information sharing, and how does that work with other countries? Because obviously you're not monitoring financial transactions. You're only monitoring financial transactions in Canada, right?
Well, to clarify, thank you. We don't actually monitor the transactions. It's our reporting entities that monitor the transactions. And crowdfunding platforms themselves are not covered in the US, for example, under FinCEN. Crowdfunding platforms are not covered. However, anybody that's donating to a GoFundMe page, for example, they would donate through a payment processor, which means they would identify themselves. They would need a credit card. They would need to fill in their personal information so that the donation itself may be validated that the funds exist, and then the funds would be transferred to GoFundMe. When GoFundMe is dispersing the money to the particular cause, if they are using a Canadian bank account, that disbursement will go through the Canadian bank account. If our Canadian bank, for example, deemed that disbursement to be suspicious or relevant to money laundering or terrorist financing or IMV activity, they would in fact report suspicious transactions to us. So we don't monitor what GoFundMe may have, but when the disbursement is made through a Canadian bank in the case of Canadian donation pages that have been established. And when a donation page is established, the organizer of that page must also identify themselves, the purpose for the cause, the purpose and the way in which the funding would be dispersed once it's
so I
raised.
Guess the part though, is there information sharing between the United States and Canada? So your equivalent in the United States, do you have information sharing between?
In fact, thank you very much for the question. We do, in fact, have 103 or 100 MOUs with International Financial Intelligence Units. So if FinCEN were to receive a SAR, which is a suspicious activity report, which is the equivalency or report, and there's always possibilities for voluntary information records or voluntary submissions of suspicion to FinCEN or to FinTrack, we would, in fact, and FinCEN would share that intelligence with us. We would then seek permission to further share that information if it met our threshold to our law enforcement or national security agencies, depending on the event. And in fact, we have done, FinCEN is our largest partner for the sharing of financial intelligence back and forth, either spontaneously or as a result of a request for information. So it can be done both ways.
Thank you. Probably is my last question. I'll see how much time. Do you that you need to be able to do meaningful compliance? I'm not trying to play the good work that you do, but you know, I'm sure it gets busier for you and more complicated, and people get. There's a lot of nuances in the work that you do. So I'm just wondering if you have the resources that you need, or if you could do with more.
Thank you very much for the question. As a civil servant, I think anybody would always say, oh, just give us more. But I think the key really to effective compliance is the partnerships that we have developed with our reporting entities. Our reporting entities really do take their role seriously. They see themselves, and they are the front line of money laundering and terrorist financing in Canada. They are the ones that we rely on and the police rely on in terms of investigations and the use of financial intelligence. We continue to modernize our compliance program. We continue to look at a risk-based approach in terms of compliance and our approach to compliance, so that we spend and use our resources to the most and the best effect that we can to address the highest risk areas and to ensure the compliance with those risk areas. And a lot of the compliance also goes to the education that's provided either through our strategic intelligence, our significant outreach, our significant training, because the better the reporting entities are at understanding what the indicators are and how to report, the better reports we get.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Ms. Michaud, it's your turn. You have 6 minutes and the floor is yours.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you for your statement. Mr. McKillop, you were saying in your opening remarks that the social funding sites such as GoFundMe are not among the regulated sectors according to the Money Laundering Act and the Funding of Terrorist Activities Act, and this was implemented in the 2000s. GoFundMe, for example, was created in 2010. Do you think that the current state of law is not adapted to the new reality of the internet and the virtual reality that we're faced with, and that legislative changes are required to make sure that social financing businesses such as GoFundMe be subject to the Act. Answer: thank you. Inaudible. We're always looking at what we can do to improve. Are there other sectors that should be covered or not covered? But when you think about this, it's really a balance that needs to be struck between the desire to have the most amount of intel possible. Of course, the Deputy Director of Intelligence, I would like to have as much information as possible, but there's a balance that needs to be struck between what is reported to FINTRAC and the private lives and the respect of individuals' privacy and the use of their funding, etc. So there's always a balance that needs to be struck. So we're always looking at sectors that could improve our current regime. I don't necessarily think that we can add sectors because they're being used in a certain way. It depends. It depends if it's a sector that's at risk for terrorist activities or money laundering, and what will happen if they become entities like this. Pages such as GoFundMe, for example, are set up in the U.S., not in Canada, and they're not subject to our Act and vice versa. So it doesn't mean that we shouldn't do the necessary study to see if there is a way to improve our own regime and to improve the coverage or the use of other sources. We did the same thing with virtual currency or cryptocurrency. This was not covered, and now it is. And they report to us, and we receive reports with regards to cryptocurrency. So we're always trying to improve our system. Thank you. You were talking about having as much intelligence and information as possible. This type of organization is not necessarily subject to the Act. We understand that they themselves have to be of goodwill to send you the information if you're investigating, regardless of the platform or the business. If you see that there's a huge amount of money that's being gathered in a small amount of time, if you see organizations that are affiliated to the extreme right, and that can do this, does this raise any red flags? Do you look at it? Or if there's no information sent to you, you don't necessarily look at it? How does it work? Answer? Well, we always look at what's happening, and our reporting entities, well, as I was saying, there's an intersection between the financial system. So there has to be a bank account used, or there has to be a bank used to share the money that is collected. Our reporting entities do a lot of research in the media. They look at the media each and every day. They know who's involved. They know who the organizers are. They know what's happening in the world. They always check to see if there are people who are known bad actors, let us say. If they're involved, this is always looked at, and they try to submit the information to us. And so there's always a link with the financial system, and this is where we receive reports. We will receive reports if there's a link with funding of terrorism or money laundering. So right now, of course, we're looking at the money that was amassed for the convoy that's now become a siege here in Ottawa in front of the Parliament. So we have this in mind, but looking at other files that you've worked with is the anonymous character of donations, something that, well, according to you, does this open the door to criminal activity or to money laundering when you see all these anonymous donations that are being made? Thank you for the question. The question of anonymity, well, this is a gray zone because the donations are not really anonymous. To make a donation, people have to use a credit card. They have to go through a system such as Stripe, for example, in order to send money to the cause. So it's not really anonymous. What we see publicly is anonymous. We don't see the name of the donor. It appears as anonymous. It's as if during our funding campaign I was to make a donation and I was asked, well, do you want your name to appear? If I say no, it's going to say anonymous, but it's not really anonymous. And the company, such as Stripe or GoFundMe, they know exactly who this is. GoFundMe decided to close the page and to refund the donors. This leads me to believe that they do have all the necessary information on the credit cards and the individuals, allowing for refunds. So donations are not truly.
Fascinating point, and maybe a good one to end this particular exchange. Now we'll go to Mr. McGregor, who will have 6 minutes in questions, and the floor is now yours. Mr. McGregor, take it away.
Thank you so much, Chair. The special bulletin that FINTRAC produced on IMVE stated that IMVE threat actors have raised funds through crowdfunding and through accepting donations. And, our Canadian Security Intelligence Service has divided it roughly into four categories. That's xenophobic violence, anti-authoritarian violence, gender-driven violence, and other grievance-driven violence. And of course, our criminal code has a definition of terrorism, which is, an act committed in whole or in part for a political, religious, or ideological purpose, objective, or cause, with the intention of intimidating the public. And the activities recognized as criminal within this context, they can include significant property damage and interference or disruption of essential services, facilities, or systems, which I think any casual observer looking at Ottawa right now could probably make a link. I guess what I'm trying to dig into here is the relationship between the payment service providers, like, for example, Stripe and PayPal, the crowdfunding organization, and then the financial entity to which the funds are eventually distributed to. For example, do the payment service providers, do they have information when they're receiving donations? Do they understand or do they, why the donations are coming in? Do they understand for what purpose they're coming in? Does the crowdfunding site have that link with the service provider?
That's a little outside of my lane, but thank you very much for the question. I'm not an expert on the service provision or the service provider or GoFundMe, but my understanding is that the page is set up for a particular cause. People use, when they want to donate, it's a behind the scenes service that's provided. So Stripe, for example, would have the identity of the person that is making the donation. They would have their credit card, they would have all their identification in order to validate that the funds exist and transfer to the particular page. So they would know that it's going to a particular page. My understanding as well is that both Stripe and PayPal, GoFundMe, Give, Send, Go, they all have terms of service which they clearly identify that they will not support anything that is related to money laundering, criminal activity, or terrorist financing. Many of these, I would assume, given that they exist in Stripe, for example, in 1 million different companies and hundreds of countries, that they do as well have their own internal compliance program, their own internal media watch program, that they are very socially responsible when it comes to identifying where that money may be going, and I would think not want to process money that were going to a cause that was identified as an illegal cause, for example. But
yeah, that was sort of the essence of my question. I mean, because the financial service company like PayPal, they are required to report to you. But would they understand or would they be able to generate their own intelligence that we know this money was going to a particular crowdfunding site for this cause? Would they be able to generate that intelligence if they thought it was suspicious?
They would, and PayPal and Stripe could, as registered MSBs, they would and could submit reports to us with respect to that.
Ms. Ryan, did you have something to add?
Yeah, I'd like to. I'd like to just point out that the special bulletin that you refer to was produced explicitly by FinTrack to inform the reporting entities what to look for. And we work closely, as my colleague Barry said, with international partners to keep track of emerging trends so that we can feed that back to our private sector partners so that, they know what to look for. And, I would say that the fact that we're able to follow those trends and then feed them back to partners, as you see in the report, shows that, there is essentially line of sight to the crowdfunding sector through the PSBs that are reporting to us, through the MSBs that do report to us based on their ability to follow the transactions back to individuals. We can then, look at the relevant patterns and have a sense of, what's suspicious, what raises to the level that our colleagues on the operational side can share with competent authorities. And in that way, that's how the system remains fresh as to, what is suspicious as illicit activity evolves through time.
And just quickly, I've only got 45 seconds. Just, when you are producing actionable intelligence for law enforcement, I know you're not an investigative agency, but you do formulate a lot of your opinions based on the reports you receive. I mean, but do you also passively receive information from other sources? I mean, you see the news every day. You're aware of what's going on. Does that how much does that figure in your reporting to intelligence agencies?
In 10 seconds, I'm afraid.
Yeah. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Yes, we do open source intelligence in support of the disclosures that we produce, and we will provide that with the disclosures if it's relevant.
Appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you. Colleagues, I'm looking at the clock. We have a hard stop at the top of the hour. We have 15 minutes left, and coincidentally and happily, that means that I could call on a representative from each party, and they can take their full allotment of time, and we should end within a minute. So, Mr. Van Popta, you're first. You have 5 minutes. Please proceed.
Good. Thank you very much. And thank you, Mr. McKillop and Ms. Ryan, for being here and informing us on the important work that you do. I want some clarification maybe from Mr. McKillop. And that is that if my understanding of your testimony is correct, a crowdfunding platform is not regulated by FinTrack. So they would never make the report, but it is the money service businesses that are feeding money to the crowdfunding platform or a bank receiving the money from the crowdfunding platform that are regulated to report suspicious transactions. Is my understanding correct?
That is correct, sir.
Okay, good. So thank you. So, a money service business such as Stripe or PayPal or Visa or MasterCard or whoever it might be, are there clear guidelines as to what they have to look for terrorism type funding or money laundering? What do they look for?
Thank you, sir, for the question. They do have clear guidelines. The guidelines are available and they're on our website. We provide guidelines. We identify as well different reasons perhaps for submitting STRs, and we provide those guidelines. We also provide a number of very specific indicators that would help them in their transaction monitoring. For example, we have 5 very, very successful public-private partnerships dealing with human trafficking, fentanyl trafficking, romance scams, underground banking, child sexual exploitation material on the internet. These PPPs, as we call them, we have set out with our reporting entities, and we provide very actionable indicators that they can plug into their own systems to create the algorithms to assist them in identifying suspicious transactions that may be related to those types of predicate crimes. We've also provided them with terrorist financing indicators, IMVE indicators, as my colleague mentioned, to assist them in identifying those types of transactions. As you know, it's often not simply one transaction, but often a pattern of transactions that's required to look at, and we assist them in providing them as many clear indicators, guidance, outreach, training in order to enhance that. And I think that the success that we've seen is, I think, demonstrable through the increase in our suspicious transaction reports that we've received year over year, as well as the increase in the number of voluntary information records that we've received from the police seeking our assistance in their investigations. As those increase, we've been able to increase our disclosures, and it clearly shows that not only are the reporting entities doing their job really, really well in providing us those reports, but the police and our law enforcement and national security agencies, both in Canada and internationally, significantly appreciate our disclosures and are coming in to get them as often as they possibly can to assist in their investigations.
Good, thank you. Ms. Ryan, I think your hand is up.
It is, sir. I'd like to draw your attention to several international documents that our reporting entities would also consult, which Canada works quite closely to produce. These include, in July of 2019, Terrorist Financing Risk Assessment Guidance, in July of 2021, Ethnically or Racially Motivated Terrorism Financing, and as well, specific documents such as the Financial Action Task Force's best practices on combating the abuse of not-for-profit organizations. So we do work quite closely on a very rich and detailed guidance that is based on.
So I think you've gone on to mute. Okay, good. Okay, thank you. So there's an increase in SAR, suspicious activity reporting. So is that an indication of more suspicious transactions happening, or the reporting entities just getting better at understanding what to look for?
Thank you for the question. And you're right, it is suspicious transaction reporting in Canada. The SARs are in the US. I believe it's a combination of both. It's not that we have, an explosion of criminality necessarily, and better at identifying predicate crimes associated to money laundering and or terrorist financing. And it's the quality of those reports us to do our job, to meet our threshold, and to provide actionable intelligence to our law enforcement, national security agencies, both in Canada as well as internationally. As I mentioned, we do have 109 or 110 MOUs with international FIUs that we can share information with.
Thank you very much. And now I'll turn the floor over to Mr. Noor Mohammed. Sir, you have 5 minutes to question. Go ahead.
Thanks very much, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Mr. McKillop and Ms. Ryan, for joining us. Mr. McKillop, I guess a question for you to start with. You know, we've seen over the course of the last little while a lot of interest from the United States in the funding situation related to GoFundMe and the blockade of Ottawa. You've seen some fairly unsavory characters in the U.S. like Marjorie Taylor Greene weighing in on this. How concerned should Canadians be about foreign funding or foreign funds coming into Canada and spurring on ideologically motivated violent extremism?
Thank you for the question, Mr. Chair. What's happening in Ottawa has not been, to my knowledge, identified as ideologically motivated violent extremism. We might come into Canada to support ideologically motivated violent extremism, and the United States would be extremely concerned about money leaving the States or funding such extremist actions. Our partners in FinCEN are quite alive to this. We share a lot of intelligence back and forth with respect to IMVEs, with respect to traveling people that want to leave the country to participate in terrorist activities, for example. So we do, and we work with our Egmont and our Five Eyes partners very closely with respect to that. So any funding that would be linked to IMVE is of extreme concern and importance to us, and we would disclose that intelligence to our law enforcement and national security partners. So I believe that any action that's taken by those actors or by sanctioned groups, for example, a listed terrorist organization, for example, or members that are, or people that are known to be members of those organizations, both our financial institutions, but also those in the United States, I'm sure, know who these people are. They do monitor their transactions and they do report actions or completed with respect to them.
So one very brief question then. Do you have any concerns or have there been any flags raised thus far around potential sources of funding for what has been happening in Ottawa?
Thank you for the question. No, the sources of funding that we've seen today, we have not seen a spike. And as you know, I can't speak to specific reporting or reporting on any individuals or organizations, but we have not seen a spike in suspicious transaction reporting, for example, related to this.
Great, thank you. I'm going to give the rest of my time to Mr. Zuberi, whatever time I have left.
Thank you, Mr. Nur Mohammed, and thank you to witnesses for being here. I just want to ask, zoom out a bit and ask a question related to individuals who might find that their transactions are frozen, international transactions. And these are law-abiding citizens, Canadians, who have no problems at all with the law and are upright citizens. Do they have any recourse when let's say that they're sending money to a family member? Is there any recourse for them to untangle themselves and they believe it's a false positive and that's why their money has been intercepted? Can you inform us about that?
Thank you, sir, for the question. That would not be certainly a role that FINTRAC plays. As I mentioned, we can neither investigate, nor can we seize, nor can we freeze funds, nor do we ask any financial institution to delay a financial transaction. The recourse would be with their own financial institution if in fact their funds were put on hold or were frozen. We have seen that happen. It's happened in instances where we see this through some of the suspicious transaction reporting where the narrative, the bank, for example, may tell us that the funds were put on hold until such time as their request for further information was completed and fulfilled by the individual. And then it's really up to the banks and the other financial institutions who have their own, and they determine their own level of risk that they're willing to manage with respect to the accounts and the accounts of their clients. So this would really be something that the individual would have to take up with their own bank and to determine what the risk was that was identified by the bank and how that may be mitigated.
Thank you. And we have about 40 seconds. And related to that, do you provide guidelines along those questions, clarity for banks and other institutions around that?
No, our guidelines are more along the lines of what they need to report to us and how to report, not how to manage their own risk and risk determination, nor how they manage the accounts of their clients. That is
thank you very much. And now I'll turn to Ms. Michaud. Ms. Michaud, you have 2.5 minutes.
Merci,
the floor is yours.
Merci, Monsieur.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. You mentioned that your mandate is to fight against money laundering and the funding of terrorist activities. When there are social funding platforms or businesses that are not subject to the Act on the proceeds of crime or the funding of terrorist activities, do you think that this poses problems in Canada's ability to detect and prevent not only money laundering and the funding of terrorist activities, but also foreign interference, given that some platforms or businesses can be based in other countries and money can come from foreign countries as well? Thank you for the question. As I was saying, what we're going through right now is a unique event. We've never seen the use of these platforms as being a place that could be used to facilitate money laundering or funding of terrorism. There is always a risk, but this has not been traditionally a platform that would have been used to these ends. There are many other ways, probably easier ways, to try to launder a cash or to collect money for terrorist activity. So this is a unique event. Are we going to learn from this? Yes. Are discussions underway? Are we going to continue to discuss with our foreign partners? Yes, of course. As you mentioned, these platforms exist on the internet. They're accessible by everyone throughout the world. If someone is supporting a cause, whether it be this cause or another cause, could be helping people who wanted to leave Afghanistan. I would imagine that there were some GoFundMe for that. People from anywhere in the world can support this type of cause by making donations. So I would say that I can't give a percentage, but these social media platforms were useful for collecting money to help people in need throughout the world. So we really have to find a balance between what could be imposed as a burden and the intelligence that could be received.
So now for the last slot, I will turn to Mr. McGregor. You have 2.5 minutes, and you will take us within a minute or two to the top of the clock. Floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Chair. In April of last year, there was a data breach from the Christian crowdfunding site Give, Send, Go. That data breach revealed that there were millions of dollars that had been raised by groups banned from raising funds on other platforms. So they had been banned because of episodes of hate speech and violence that had been used on the platform. Some of the biggest beneficiaries of that had been groups like the Proud Boys, which are a designated terrorist entity. So we only learned of this because of a data breach. I'm just wondering, we as policymakers have to anticipate the new landscape that's before us. Does FinTrack have what it needs to capture this? Maybe not from a site like GoFundMe, but for other platforms which are competing for this space and for those dollars. Are there gaps that we need to plug as policymakers so that these things can be caught before they end up being just a data breach?
Thank you for your question. Mr. Chair, I think it's always good to ask the question and to do an in-depth study once you're out of a crisis to determine whether or not there are policy gaps that could be looked at and what is the best way to address those. From my perspective right now, in the situation that you mentioned, I've read about the data breach as well. The intersection with the crowdfunding platforms and our financial institutions is a must in order to disperse the money. And if the money were going through a Canadian bank, for example, and directed to the Proud Boys, they're a listed terrorist organization. That money would be stopped by the bank, and we would also get the STR. They cannot, if there's a listed terrorist organization, facilitate the transfer of that money. So it is really the intersection with our banks, and our banks are well aware of those organizations and the individuals associated with those organizations. They know who they are, they have their sanctions list, they do their monitoring, and they do their reporting, and they do it well. So from my perspective, we have that intersection, and raising is likely not helpful to those organizations, but we would get the reporting, or the funding would be stopped by the banks when it comes to those types of organizations trying to receive money.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. And I want to, on behalf of the committee, thank the witnesses for very important and thoughtful testimony this morning. It will be very important as we make through the complexities of these very important and dynamic issues. Colleagues, right on time, thank you very much for everybody's cooperation. Does the committee agree that the meeting should be adjourned? Then the meeting is adjourned. Have a good weekend, everybody. We'll see you on Tuesday. Take care.
Thanks, everybody. Thanks, Chair.